if you like, the trailer, and then as good film critics, we'll get on to key points and draw them out on that. So that worked well yesterday under Corel's chairship. We'll do the same today. The theme of this is in search of social harmony and economic equity, some case studies. This is, of course, been an abiding kind of concern from the time, at least from the time when the MDGs were initiated, or even before that, when the Human Development Reports were initiated, criticizing the GDP as the be-all and end-all of human progress and achievement. And so this issue of social harmony has become increasingly important. There are all kinds of inequalities, vertical and horizontal. There are increasing tensions. There are more conflicts intra-country in the world than between countries. So social harmony is something that is proving to be very elusive, and it's of course directly or closely related to equity. So we'll be able to have a rich discussion this morning, I'm sure. And without further ado, I'd like to request Victor to lead us off this morning. Over to you, Victor.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to be again in Rio at IDPPA conference, and thanks to all organizers. And second, I have to apologize because I arrived just a few hours ago after 16 hours flight from Moscow. So if I suddenly start randomly rambling in Russian, please interrupt me. I'm a little bit jet lagged. Let's put it in a moderate way. So it's not my normal condition. Can I somehow operate with a clicker? Here it is. Okay. So I will probably better move here. Can we please start the presentation? Today I'm going to talk about trust. Together with the colleagues of mine in the Russian Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, under the President of Russian Federation, we run this huge sociological project called Russian Barometer, which is actually based on the European barometer methodology. So this key question of trust, different types of trust and different patterns of trust, is our permanent and focal points of our research. So let's start with the most general thing, what we think when we are talking about trust. Usually in all major sociological intercultural research projects, one type of trust is considered, and this is generalized trust. Trust in human nature, trust in people in general, trust to someone you don't know personally. So for example, in World Value Survey 2014, data a little bit old, Russia considered to be one of the most less trustworthy country, where people do not trust each other in terms of generalized trust. Okay, Brazil is even less, but in Russia, it's less than 30% of population in 2014 thought that people in general can be trusted. In another huge research project, which is Edelman Barometer, Russia is the last country out of all 31 countries where this parameter was measured with the lowest result out of 28 countries, sorry. So this is another research. In Russian Barometer, we focus on generalized trust, of course, and it's clear why. Because generalized trust is a very important thing for economists. Because recently, more and more national governments all over the world start to consider generalized trust as a kind of public asset. Because in countries, mistrust is costly. When people in general do not trust others, transactional costs are going higher. Yeah, thanks. Is it better? Good. We do this research in 10 Russian regions. It's a representative sample on federal and regional level, so we can analyze also regional differentiation. And what we see there is that during last 4 years, we see even deeper decline of generalized trust. People in general believe that people cannot be trusted. So this level of potential cooperation with those whom you don't know personally is quite low. It goes from 35–40% in 2014–2015, dropped down to 25% during last years. So I will remind you, this is trust in human nature in general, right? But at the same time, we see another type of trust, which is interpersonal trust. It's trust to your social circle. It's trust to your friends. It's trust to your spouse. So interpersonal trust and generalized trust in Russia are negatively correlated. The more we trust to people we know, the less we trust to people in people we don't know. So, this is also interesting because in Russia there's a very peculiar paradox of so-called Easterlin paradox. You know, in 1970s, American economist Easterlin proved that personal subjective well-being, or as in economics they call it happiness, a very interesting economic term, is not correlated with it does not go together with income. When you don't have money, you are unhappy. When you have too much money, you are unhappy. But in general, there is no correlation there. Also, he proved that in the States, happiness correlates with education. The more educated you are, the more you are happy. And with the family life. Married people in general in the States are more happy. In Russia, it's also interesting correlation. Also, there is no correlation with income. But in general, people who are married less happy, and people who are more educated less happy. There is only one predictor in Russia, and this is social capital. It's amount of your social connections. Strong ties, friendship, and weak ties, acquaintanceship. So what we see here is that interpersonal trust is becoming a crucial thing in Russian economy during the last few years. We see also this dynamics of social capital since 2013. It's our second wave, so we do this kind of Russian barometer twice a year. And we see that weak ties, acquaintanceship, has risen from 26 to 37, and strong ties from 5 to 8, from 5 friends to 8 friends in general. And as soon as this kind of network of trust is broadening, level of generalized trust in human nature, is going down. The more we trust to people we know, and we include them in our network of trust, the less we trust in human nature in general. So, for example, it works in job search strategies. In Russia, you see that more than half of people got their jobs, their current positions, through personal acquaintanceship with employer. So formal institutions do not work on the labor market properly. And also you see interesting situation between this interpersonal and institutional trust. Sorry, it didn't work properly. But here is amount of weak ties, less than 10 weak ties and more than 200 weak ties. The more ties you have, the more social connections you have, the less you trust to formal institutions and more you trust to your immediate social circles. So this is a general thing. Trust in institutions go together with generalized trust. If we trust in what economists call bridging social capital, if we trust in human nature in general, we have more confidence in government, we have more confidence in formal institutions, we have more confidence, for example, in judicial system and healthcare system and so on. But in Russia, as soon as we trust only to people we know, we don't trust human nature in general, and of course we don't trust institutions. More than half of Russian population would prefer to die than to go to hospital, only if they don't have someone they know personally from this hospital. So this broadening of network of trust and this rise of social capital has some clear economic consequences. And one of them is economic strategies that people choose during the last 2 years in times of crisis. There are actually 2 major ways of behavior here. One is when you are trying to reduce your costs, reduce your expenses. So we call it passive economic strategies. And another one when you are searching for new sources of income. So people who are more active are people who have much stronger and broad ties, social capital, and very low trust in institutions. One of the most widespread economic strategies here is when you are actually keeping your current position, but trying to take as much freelance jobs, freelance offers as possible, using resources from your current position to work more for somebody else. So you see here that there is a correlation between level of institutional trust or mistrust and economic activization during crisis. Economically active are people who have strong connections and a lot of weak and strong ties, and do not trust an institution and do not trust in human nature in general. The same thing here, it correlates even better with the amount of your weak ties. There is also another interesting thing here. People who have more weak ties are more often involved in informal economy, bribing, corruption, and so on. So they are much more happy and they're much more corrupt. It's another thing that what we need to take into consideration when we are talking about social capital and importance of intra-group trust, so-called. So what's interesting here is that we have this disposition where generalized trust in human nature in general, and institutional trust in institutions. By the way, the most hated institution in Russia is courts, judicial system. And the second is municipality. Then goes police, and then healthcare. I still have no idea how come healthcare is so much hated in this country. So, but institutional trust and generalized trust, they go together. There is a strong positive correlation between them, and a strong negative correlation between those two types of trust and interpersonal trust. But this scheme is not complete yet, because also very important parameter that we didn't take into consideration during our previous research projects, and we took into consideration only recently during last year, and this is technology. What is a peculiar feature here is that Russians in general are much more technologically optimistic than people in European Union. So red is European Union, blue is Russia. More than 2/3 of Russian population have positive attitudes toward technological growth. It's also because of Soviet Union background, you know, when this kind of huge techno-optimistic Soviet ideology, Sputnik, Gagarin, and so on. So, but also, we see that there are different types of technological optimists. We have both scientific, where you believe in technological progress because science is cool, and also humanitarian. You believe in technological progress because it's going to solve all problems of humanity. So all those general technological attitudes in Russia are very, very positive, and trust in technology is very high now. But what is interesting is that this kind of trust in technology is a replacement or substitute for mistrust in institutions. People who believe that judges should be replaced by robots in the nearest future are people who do not believe in judicial system. They believe in robotic judges not because technology is cool by itself. They believe because they do not trust in Russian courts. More than 50% of population believe that courts would be more just if they will just toss a coin, because they strongly believe that Russian courts never take just decisions. So this also concerns the driverless cars. People in Russia believe in driverless cars, not because they love technology, but because just take a look how people drive in Moscow. For those of you who visited the IDPPA conference in Moscow, probably had this chance to see it. So this is about generalized trust, not institutional trust. So we do not believe in human nature. We don't trust people driving. That's why we would prefer driverless cars. We do not believe in institutions. We do not believe in courts. That's why we would prefer robotic judges. So this technological optimism is actually based on institutional pessimism and high level of interpersonal trust as well. So those types of technological advancements that encourage people to communicate more, that strengthen their network of interpersonal trust, actually work together with this kind of interpersonal attitudes. What is interesting here as well is that we have new kind of, it goes very opposite towards, for example, what we observe in the United States. This is a recent research of Pew Center. It's May 2017. In the States, we see totally different attitudes in general. Technological progress is considered as a threat to labor market. Automation, of course, is a terrible threat, and government is perceived as something that's supposed to protect humans against robots. We need government, we need strong institutions to protect our rights in the age of automation. In Russia, it's a totally different thing. You know all this discussion about Uber drivers, right? Like, how can you trust those people? Probably they didn't even got proper certification and so on and so on. We perfectly trust the Uber drivers, much more than our parliament members. So we would prefer to trust in Uber because it's interpersonal trust and trust in technology than any government system of taxi driver certification. Because then probably it's corrupt, then probably it's unfair, then probably is some kind of bureaucratic machine. So it's interesting that in Russia now is the lowest level of fear against artificial intelligence and the highest level of fear against natural intelligence, especially of people who are in power now. So choosing between natural intelligence and artificial one, Russians would definitely choose artificial one. Probably robotic judge not going to be bribed, optimistically. So talking about this situation, we observe interesting ideological cliche here. Because we know from the history of humanity and the history of world literature that technological optimism and technological and political optimism usually goes together. In Karl Marx's 13th chapter of Capital, Marx is making fun of Dr. Ure. He calls him Pindar of automation, who believe in benevolent force of steam. Because this kind of technological optimism from utopianism of 17th, 18th century actually suggests that technological progress will free and liberate humanity from dirty work, and humanity will be able to produce better political institutions. So technological optimism and political optimism in utopianism of 18th century went together. In 20th century, we observed a lot of anti-utopian thinking, of course, a lot of historical experience in my country in this particular way, where technological pessimism and political pessimism also went together, and this also consistent combination of social attitudes. When you believe that humanity in general is evil creature, and technology is something what allows people to be even more evil than they are, to oppress each other, to take away your freedom. So this kind of combination of social attitudes is also consistent. But what we observe now in Russia is a very peculiar, inconsistent combination of trust attitudes. Technological optimism and political pessimism. We believe in technology because we do not believe in institutions. We believe in robots because we do not believe in people. So it goes like this. Messiah is definitely going to be a robot, but Antichrist is going to be human. So robot's going to save the world unless members of Russian parliament not going to destroy it before. So in this respect, we have to deal with a totally different combination of technological and political attitudes. Third thing that I didn't talk about today, it was religious attitude, because technological optimism goes together with in Russia with religious beliefs. It's a techno religion. It's another weird thing that is still need to be discovered. So I think I will stop here and leave more time for questions if there are any. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Victor. In the discussion stage, we have to ask you what's the implications of these findings for social harmony in Russia. So there's a lot of interesting issues that are thrown up by your presentation. So thank you for that. I now I'll request Laila El-Baradi and Dina Wafa from the American University in Cairo to speak about, is there still room for civil society in Egypt?
This is easy, right? Okay. Good morning. We will be presenting you today. Is there still room for civil society in Egypt? Both my colleague, Dr. Laila El-Baradi, and myself, Dina Wafa from the American University in Cairo in Egypt. And we hope to make it as interactive as possible, so it becomes a bit interesting as we're on the fourth day of our, or the second day of the conference, fourth day together.
Clicking. Right, thank you. The good thing is that we're presenting in the morning and people are still alert and awake. And we decided to do the presentation, both of us together, to keep you focused, or try to keep you focused on what we want to talk about. The topic we're talking about is not a happy issue. It's not a happy topic. While everyone is moving towards a greater degree of good governance, or at least striving towards a greater degree of good governance, it seems in Egypt we're moving a little bit backwards on many of the dimensions of government. And what started our research concern here is the new NGO law, number 70 for 2017, which caused an uproar. It's a law that's trying to restrict the work of non-governmental organizations in Egypt. So while everyone else is talking about the importance of the role of civil society and how it is a crucial component in any good governance system, we are trying in Egypt to curb the role and restrict the role of civil society. So our research question is, to what extent this new law really represents a hindrance to the effective operation and thriving of civil society in Egypt? Many non-governmental organizations, after the law was approved by Parliament, are thinking of closing down their operations completely, or they are in a state of crisis trying to figure out how to adapt with the new law. The executive regulations have not been approved yet, so it's still a period where it's considered the grace period. They have to either adapt or close down their operations.
Our methodology for this research, we have basically done some desk research of the different legislations governing the work of civil society in Egypt. But our special focus is on the latest law passed in Parliament in 2017. This law was passed within a couple of weeks, actually. It didn't take much, or a couple of days. It didn't take much time to quickly approve it. We also explored the policy-making process for the law with the different stakeholders involved and their diverse opinions.
So we started with investigating how civil society is defined in the literature. There is a general agreement that it is this metaphorical space that lies between the state and the market. And more detailed or more meticulous definitions like that used by Civicus, the Civil Society, International Civil Society Alliance, that it is the arena outside the family, state, and market created by individual and collective actions, and they all are working to advance shared interest. And for the purpose of this paper, we're focusing more on non-governmental organizations rather than on political parties. Many have contested whether political parties should be part of civil society or not, or at least in Egypt, we've had this debate ongoing for a while. For example, in Egypt Human Development Report, the last one that was issued, they decided to exclude political parties from their definition of civil society. So we're going along with that definition, since our focus is on the non-governmental organization section.
We also show the importance of civil society for good governance, although good governance, there's been some debate on the definition of good governance with various organizations. For instance, with the World Bank and other multilateral organizations, the main focus is on economic and public sector management, while in other organizations such as the UN and OECD, it's more on the human rights and democratic process. But in all cases, the role of civil society is key, and it's important for good governance. As we look, for instance, at the World Bank 6 main dimensions of good governance, we see they include voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption, and for any of the dimensions to be effective, we need a strong civil society to act as their watchdog role and hold governments accountable.
So whatever the state of the democracy in a nation, we assume that to make it more effective, civil society is needed, and a strong civil society that is capable of holding government accountable and acting as a watchdog. This interactive World Bank Governance Indicators website is really quite interesting. I always advocated to my graduate students, and if there are students here, I assume you all know about it, and how you can develop graphs and compare between different nations and how they are performing on the different dimensions of governance. I think this is what we did right here, trying to compare between performance of Egypt on each of the 6 governance indicators. And we first selected 3 other developed countries, Brazil, Denmark, and the United States. You can pick and choose whichever. And it shows clearly that Egypt is lagging behind these developed countries in terms of all the 6 dimensions of good governance that we talked about. And if we compare the performance of Egypt over time, from 2006 to 2011, which was the year of the 25th of January revolution, up to 2016, interestingly, we will find that, for example, in political stability and absence of violence and terrorism, we're doing worse than what we were doing in 2006. In government effectiveness, we're not also progressing. In regulatory quality, we're not progressing. In rule of law, we're not progressing. Maybe voice and accountability, it shows here that it's stable, but I have strong doubts. The only dimension where we did well was maybe fighting corruption. The current government is taking action to try to identify corruption cases in many government organizations, and they are progressing on that dimension. But we had a revolution in 2011 with the idea that we're going to live a utopia in a few years afterwards and progress in all dimensions of good governance. The young people were sort of dreaming for a better Egypt, but reality is we're not really doing that well, compared even to 2011 or 2006 before the revolution. So it's not a happy story. No. But sometimes we have a proverb in Egypt that says, شر البلايا ما يضحك. The harder it gets, the more difficult it gets, it sometimes turns into being sort of funny. Dark comedy, me. Okay. Right,
and so in order to look at civil society in Egypt, we looked at the Enabling Environment Index developed by Civicus. This index basically looks at 53 indicators to show how civil society is able to work. And they are basically divided into those 8 points here, like, for instance, civil society's legitimacy, transparency, and accountability. Now, as we look through them and then as we progress through our presentation, we will find that in most of what we are mentioning here, it will be pretty weak according to this new law. For instance, there's instance on legitimacy and accountability, where groups should make efforts to be transparent and accountable to their stakeholders. There's a focus on building connections, coalitions, and solidarity, which is again is pretty weak, not only in Egypt, but in the region as a whole. Building coalitions is something that lags behind in our region. The legal and regulatory environment, of course, with the new law, we will look at it in more detail to see how it's actually very repressive to civil society work. The political environment, and that in particular again is in Egypt with issues of trust, as Victor was talking about trust just now. We have big issues in trust, particularly between the state and the rest of the country. So
it's more severe in Russia. Victor said that you'd prefer to die rather than go to a public hospital. Maybe we can choose to go to public hospital and then die.
And then
I don't know. Okay.
public attitudes and perception, and again, how this is played in Egypt. This also reminds me of our very first presentation in the student workshop about the bots and how it influences people. And here, again, this is very important to see how public perception is quite influenced to accept such perhaps repressive laws and happily embrace them as well. Corruption, although as we saw in the indicators that there has been some development with regards to corruption in Egypt, these are tiny steps. There's not real huge progress, but some progress. Communication and technology, how it should be reliable, cheap, and widespread. Again, not the case where we're closing down sites, and some applications as well, such as Skype and so on, are being shut down in Egypt. Resources and how civil society groups should be able to access resources, including funding, of course. And this will go into more detail. I will not look at this now so that we can discuss in more detail later. Now, the good thing about the Enabling Environment Index is that it looks at both the demand and the supply side. The demand with regards to the citizens and civil society, and the supply with regards to the enabling, to the state and how it enables the environment. The Enabling Environment Index is actually unpacked into three dimensions: the socioeconomic environment, which looks at education, communication, equality, and gender equality. There's also the sociocultural environment, which looks at propensity to participate, tolerance, giving, and volunteering. And finally, the governance environment, which looks at the civil society infrastructure, the policy dialogue, corruption, political rights and freedoms, associational rights, rule of law, personal rights, NGO legal context, and media freedoms. And this last one, the governance environment, is given more weight than the other two together. It's actually given half the amount, and the other two together is each 25%. To give the score for each country. Now, out of 109 countries that have been studied with the Enabling Environment Index, Egypt ranks at 94. Okay, which is not that good, as in most indicators that we would compare with the Corruption Perception Index, access to information, everything. If we look at other indices, you will find Egypt similarly at the bottom of the ranks. And of course, those ranking higher up, as usual, would be Canada, Denmark, Norway, Australia, and New Zealand, as in most other indices as well. Now, as we look further, I will give you next.
Right. Why are people concerned about the new NGO law that was just issued? A lot of the international organizations, human rights, Amnesty, and a lot of the local experts and NGO activists have expressed huge concerns. These are some quotations from what many of those have said about the law and how they've described it, that it's catastrophic, it's a burden, it will lead to a complete paralysis to civil society, a huge step backward for freedom, cripples the work of the civil society organizations, specifically the non-governmental organizations. And this is not only at the local level, but at the international level as well. We concede that civil society organizations and having a strong civil society organization is not a panacea. It's not a solution for all our problems, and that there is a need to regulate civil society. But what's happening in Egypt is another story. But despite that, there are those who are still in support of what the government is doing and of the new law. It was approved by Parliament, after all.
Okay. I get the role of defending. Well, yes, there are those who support the law, and as I mentioned earlier, how they managed to get people's support on this. There are a lot of suspicions and fears, especially after the revolution and the Muslim Brotherhood rule. A large number of the population fear the return of this rule, and so there's a lot of playing on these feelings. Like, for instance, the head of the legislative committee and parliament, he said that this new law is important as it will overcome all the suspicious funding and activities going around in the country, all those conspiracy theories being promoted to the public, and how that once we remove all of these and start fresh, we will start a new relation between the state and civil society, a good one that works toward our needs and not what the foreign agenda to our country and our state as Egyptians, and all of these slogans. Those supporting also have some claims, and of course they play with what has happened after the revolution. You see, there was a large number of civil society organizations that sprung up after that, and most of them, like 60%, were related to Islamic organizations, while 20% had those revolutionary slogans. And again, this reinforces those who are supporting the new law that, yes, we have to have a clean slate and start fresh with those who actually work toward the development of the country.
Dina was representing the voice of government here. And members of parliament who just rubber stamped the law. The relationship between civil society and the government over the years, over the past decades, has been characterized by being ebbing and flowing. So it's not the first time there was a crisis situation faced in terms of the civil society operating in Egypt. Going back to Nasser's era, President Nasser in the 60s, there was this abolishment, this nationalist and socialist era, the decision made to abolish political parties completely. It was one of the slogans of the 1952 revolution / coup d'etat that happened at that era, that political parties are corrupt and we will operate without political parties. Later on, Mubarak's era, it witnessed restrictions being imposed on non-governmental organizations, and all NGOs that were accepting funding, especially from external donor agencies, had to get prior approvals from the Ministry of Social Solidarity. But it was not just the ministry, it was also national security having an input, what's going to be acceptable and what's not. It was only after the 2011 of Jan revolution that we can say there was a honeymoon period for civil society in Egypt. A lot of young people started their own movements, started their own NGOs, started advocating for human rights, democracy, awareness about civil rights, and they were left for a couple of years to operate smoothly without any confrontation with the government. But now back to the current regime, 2013 and afterwards, the general atmosphere between governments and civil society can be characterized by mistrust in general, by confrontation, and two main issues stand to the fore. That of the foreign funding case, lawsuit, that Dina is going to talk to a little bit more, and the restrictive legislative framework, focusing on the current law 2017.
The foreign funding issue. Now, in 2011, just after the January 25th revolution, there was a big crackdown on foreign funding agencies foreign funding agencies that have worked in Egypt for decades, including the IRI, the Human Rights Watch, Konrad Adenauer, many of well-known funding agencies. They were all taken in and put in prisons.
Not all of them.
Yeah,
only
but the foreign, for a while,
Okay.
for a while they did. And all foreign personnel were, of course, allowed to leave to their countries, whether facing whatever, but the Egyptian staff still remain facing cases that they had some interference in state security and so on, and ambiguous accusations. But from then on, with the foreign funding issues and such cases, it was like sending strong messages to all funding agencies: beware. That it's not easy to work. And we'll see even with the new law how it's stated clearly with regards to funding agencies. It's not just left to speculation any longer.
The government's position in that case is that these NGOs that were accused of accepting foreign funding without getting the needed permissions, and that the registration papers were incomplete. But that included, for example, Konrad Adenauer, who had been supporting the government of Egypt, maybe even the cabinet, the public universities where I used to work for decades. We were accepting donations for Konrad Adenauer, and it was all right. But suddenly they realized that the registration papers for Konrad Adenauer are incomplete, and staff working there, some of them were in prison. 16 of the 43 accused staff members were US nationals, and those were let go after a while. But those who were kept intact in prison were the Egyptian nationals, those who did not have any other dual nationality specifically.
Yeah. Actually, we're going to have a look at this new law and how... Okay. Now, this new law was issued without prior discussion, although since the revolution, there have been many organizations that have put out drafts for discussion, anticipating that there will be a new law for civil society. All of these were put aside, and all of a sudden, the new law just appeared, and within a few days was discussed and approved in Parliament, and quickly also ratified by the president, and we're just waiting for it to be put in effect very quick. As this is also not just particular to civil society law, we've had several laws passed in the past few months very quickly, a lot of them controversial, but this is our main focus for this research.
The main other issues that are taken against the law is that it provides excessive hurdles to new registrations. It's going to take much more time to get approval from the government to operate. Security is having a formal role now in approving the operation of civil society, although according to the constitution, it should be only by informing the government that you want to start an NGO, but this is not the case. You have to get approval from a Supreme Committee in which security is represented. Most of the international civil society organizations are moving out of Egypt or freezing their operations for a while. Even Ford Foundation, for example, is concerned currently. Under the pretext of controlling civil society organizations, there has been a very severe backlash, especially on those working on advocating for human rights or for advocating for democracy. The current regime's justification is that this is not the time to be considering human rights or democracy. We are not in a situation that allows us democracy or the human rights as a privilege. This should be the concern of developed nations, but we are in a different situation.
Yes, that we have national security to consider at the moment, and this takes priority to everything. In the previous law, it was stated that civil society needed some permissions to do their work, and this was mainly with the Ministry of Social Solidarity, but this was just a statement and not really applied so much. But with the new law, it's going to be reinforced, and it's going, not only the Ministry of Social Solidarity is involved, but several ministries, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of Defense, of Justice, of Interior, of International Cooperation, along with the Social Solidarity, of course, and General Intelligence, the National Bank, and the money laundering unit. So it's a big, huge pack of people all together, looking at several issues, looking at sources of funding, approving the funding. What are you going to be doing with the money, okay? And who are you going to hire, including any foreign experts? This will be extremely restricted. And of course, any violations to taking permissions, we will face with harsh penalties, including up to 5 years in prison and up to 1 million Egyptian pounds as a penalty, which of course is a huge amount, and where people would not take such risks to work in civil work.
Why are they doing this? Several reasons. Why are they coming up with this very restrictive NGO law? One explanation is that the Mubarak's regime is back. The revolution led to the ousting of the head of the regime, Mubarak, and a few of his supporters. But now the people in power are really of the same background. So they view civil society to have played an active role in the revolution, and they don't want to hear of these things again. They want to make sure that there will be no room for anyone talking of human rights violations or creating awareness about democracy. Another reason was that the Muslim Brothers were active in having their own philanthropic organizations and delivering services to people in different areas all around Egypt, and this brought them a lot of support. And they, as a result, won the elections, and they don't want this happening once again. Plus, they were suspicious of some NGOs who did not have their registration papers completely transparent. Right. How does the Enabling Environment Index applies? All right. What's interesting about the Enabling Environment Index is that it specifies a role for the NGOs themselves. They need to be more transparent. They need to work as coalitions and to be cooperating with one another. And this is not happening on the demand side in Egypt. From the supply side, the side of the government, it needs to make sure that there is a really permissible, less restrictive legal environment. It needs to work towards a greater degree of democracy. This is not happening. It needs for citizens to accept one another and be less polarized and less afraid of announcing their affiliations, whether political, religious, or otherwise. It needs that government stops blocking websites and censoring media. But there is a role also for both sides, demand and supply, indicators that they should work on. Like, for example, CSOs to come up with creative means of securing resources, since the NGO is going to be very restrictive on their ability to accept either foreign or even local funding, then they should come up with more creative means to come up with resources. And the government needs to lessen restrictions and complications on funding opportunities. They won't be able to operate. The civil societies, government, and political officials, they need to continue their fight on corruption. So there's a role for the CSOs on their own, for the government, making it possible, and for both of them taking a lead in various of these indicators. The conclusion is that, going back to the original research question that we started with, is there still space for civil society in Egypt? There is a very limited space, but only for those who are working in philanthropy, in development issues, if they manage to conform with the restrictive NGO law, be very transparent about even their local donors, and are supporting government, they will be allowed to operate, but very limited, non-existent space for advocacy and human rights organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. What you say has, I think, resonance in all of the countries that are members of the IDPPA. So we're bound to have a good discussion on this theme. It's now, I'd like to invite Nick Rosner to talk about collaborative governance in Malaysia. It's intriguingly subtitled, "A Public Policy Brand."
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the picture of Kuala Lumpur, a view from my office window. Okay. The title is Collaborative Governance in Malaysia, a Public Policy Brand. This paper is co-authored by myself, Siti Balkis, and Azman Mahmud, a senior officer at the Ministry of Federal Territory, Kuala Lumpur. The outline of this paper, I will first give a brief introduction, the aim of the paper, and defining the collaborative governance and its framework, Malaysia briefly, a problem statement, and collaborative governance in perspective, and finally the conclusion. Just as a way of introduction, Malaysia is gripped with desire to transform. It has its Vision 2020 and now carved another vision, National Transformation to 2050, which all of this vision promises for inclusiveness, growth, and resilience. When Najib came into administration in September 2009, the first thing he did was to establish a unit called Pemandu, in short. Pemandu means Performance Management and Delivery Unit, and it's charged with transforming Malaysia into high-income economy in 2020, which is another 2 years' time, and TN50, or Transformasi Nasional 50, meaning that Malaysia is to be top 20 economies in the world by 2050. So Pemandu is mandated to catalyze these bold changes in public and private sector delivery. So the narratives of the government is that the government could not be solving all the problems. Therefore, all government ministries, agencies, public sector, public sector, private sector, civil society, they need to come down together. They need to collaborate, and under the National Blue Ocean Strategy, as this strategy that is for rapid execution, low cost, high impact, and sustainable. So by now, about 80 ministries, agencies, organizations collaborate together, in which they call it collaborative governance, to ensure that the transformation be realized. There are rosy pictures being painted by the government, such as from 2009 to 2015, the GNI increased to 50%, at least 1.8 million jobs created. Inflation is low, FDI increased by 22% per annum. And the transformation would be in the public service, community transformation, safety and security. So the aim of this paper is to present and assess the collaborative governance in Malaysia under the enforce of National Blue Ocean Strategy in its drive to achieve its vision for transformation. As I said, rosy pictures have been painted. So this paper, it sets out to answer the question, to what extent is this collaborative governance really working? Do the ministries, agencies, and civil society collaborate for the common good? It takes a case study. It takes a close look at OPSBAH, an abbreviated form meaning OPSBAH in Malay meaning that an operation to curb illegal activities. And this is done in the city of Kuala Lumpur. So I first define what is collaborative governance. Ansel and Gash states that it's a governing arrangement where one or more public agencies directly engaged non-state stakeholders in a collective decision-making process that is formal, consensus-oriented, and deliberative, and that aims to make or implement public policy or manage public program or assets. But for this purpose, I use the Emerson, Nabachi, and Bellot's collaborative governance framework. And they define as the process and structures of public policy decision-making and management that engage people constructively across the boundaries of public agencies, levels of government, and or carry out a public purpose that could not otherwise be accomplished. According to Bellot's, Nabachi, and Emerson, there are a few elements that can drive this collaborative governance to work. One is the drivers. It has to have leadership and also interdependence among the agency. And it has to have a consequential incentives, either internal, that is problems, resource needs, interests or opportunities, or external, situational or institutional crisis, threats or opportunities. Another is independence. These organizations would not be able to accomplish something on their own, or it could also be termed as sector failure. And another is uncertainty in managing the societal problems. And for the collaboration to work, Emerson, Nabachi, and Bellot states that it has to have its participants, that is members, stakeholders, partners, depending on the context and objectives of the collaboration. Another is principal engagement and shared motivations. That is, they develop a shared sense of purpose. And also generation of capacity for joint action, that is in having procedural and institutional arrangements, knowledge and resources. So Malaysia in brief, Malaysia is a multi-ethnic, multicultural population of 30 million people. And in Kuala Lumpur, approximately 3 million people. But by day, it can swell up to 5 million people. It has a federal constitutional monarchy with parliamentary system. And the legal system based on the UK, but it is unique in its arrangement in that the Sharia court exists side by side in a dual court structure. Sharia deals with the Islamic matters. And GDP growth averaged 6.4% per year since 1970, except for these few years when there is an economic downturn. So Malaysia is ranked upper middle income. With vibrant economy in Malaysia, there are a few issues that the government has to grapple with. And mainly this is in the city of Kuala Lumpur. One is the illegal immigrants. According to government records, there are 2.1 million migrant workers. These are registered. There are more unregistered migrant workers. And it estimated that it is 15% of the workers, of the Malaysian workers. And then there is also the transnational crime, the drug smuggling, human trafficking, cyber gambling, and drug abuse, unlicensed businesses and illegal activities, not to mention the money laundering and all. So each regulatory agencies have conducted raids based on their scope and responsibilities. And these agencies and ministries are governed by their respective acts and regulations over years, but they have made very little impact. Cyber gambling, for example, just to show the extent of the problem. One night, each den can make up to 16 million ringgit, or for about almost close to 4 million US dollars per night. So the extent is too much for each of these regulatory agency to make impact, because once they raid, but the next night they are in business again. So faced with all these atrocities, an OPSBA called by the Ministry of Federal Territories formed on 16 April 2014, and it encompasses 24 ministries, agencies, and 16 NGOs. The target is in 6 core areas: illegal cyber gambling, illegal immigrants, entertainment centers, unlicensed entertainment centers, drug abuse, vices and close proximity, and unlicensed massage parlors at 11 constituencies of Kuala Lumpur. I'm not sure whether you can read this, but these are the list of ministries and agencies and the NGOs involved. Among the NGOs, UniRazak, the university that I come from, is also in the list. And myself and Balkis, we sometimes follow these conducted raids together to see for ourselves what is happening in the field. So all the agencies listed in the right are the main agencies. And following this OPSBA, we found that there are 2 levels of committee. One is the Task Force Secretariat, and another is the Task Force Coordination Committee. The Task Force Coordination Committee meets once a year. The Task Force Secretariat meets ever so often. And they also have yearly meetings and seminars, and they have WhatsApp group. They constantly communicate with each other among these agencies and ministries. They motivate each other, and they update each other about the rates. And it is also during these regular meetings that they clarify each other's tasks, and sometimes they criticize each other for the improvement. And they have agreed that there is no one act to govern the conduct of the rates. Each agency is governed by their own acts and regulations. These are the laws and regulations provided for the rates. The agency is this is the Dewan Bandaraya or the City Hall. This is the Drug Addiction Dadah National Drug Agency, Immigration, Customs, Police. Among all these agencies, police have got the most power. They can charge to court. The rest, the other agencies have no power to charge in court. And the Jawi, this is the for working for Sharia court. Income tax. You may be wondering why income tax is there. When a company having 16 million ringgit or 5 million US dollars per night, and they're not paying a cent. So when the LHDN or the income tax, the revenue comes in, then these businesses start to register. But they're paying tax on illegal money, on illegal gains. So since 2014 to 2017, there has now been 38 raids. And they come about 300 to 400 people from each of these agencies and NGOs. And they really make an impact. It used to be that when each of these agency raids, the next morning or the next day, they are in business again. But this time when they come in group, they cripple the business. These are the activities and illegal business according to the constituencies. There are altogether, can you see? Is it clear enough? This is the estimate number of premises in the city. And total number of rates, 60. And estimated number of premises, 615 premises. And total illegal premises, these are without licenses, 2,464 premises. These are reports on confiscation in 2017 alone. I wanted to get the reports from each agency before the collaborative governance, but none of the agency refused to even to let me review the report, meaning that it's very embarrassing for them. It was very embarrassing for each of the agency because they do raids, but the next morning or the next day, these raided premises are in business again with the confiscated machinery again, meaning there's also corruption. And this is the report from 2014 until 2017. But you may not be able to see it, but what I meant to say here is that they really make an impact. Okay, now I go back to the collaborative governance in perspective as basing on the framework by Emerson, Nabachi, and Ballots about the drivers, the participants, and the consequential incentives. Before, the drivers was that the external system, there was a lot of problem, increasing social problem, and there were calls from the public, reports in the newspaper regularly, almost daily, about the problem in the city and also in the periphery of the city. And also the worry from the public that this causes the rubric of the society. And also the dismal result of past efforts from each of these agencies, which I said sector failure, and also the interdependence of agencies. And this is happening. Another is for collaborations to work. You need participants. These participants are on voluntary basis. They are civil servants by day, and they are volunteers to rigs at night. And they are very committed to problem solving, and the leadership is provided by individual from the Ministry of Federal Territory, who is also one of the co-author, and it is strongly backed up by the Federal Territory, Ministry of Federal Territory. And there is this principal engagement and shared motivations. As I said, the 2 levels of committee, and they meet regularly, they exchange knowledge and expertise, and there is also seminars to train each other, and generation of shared capacity, clarifying and adjusting their tasks, clarity of directions, and each of these agencies, they also establish procedures for each individual to adhere to. So in conclusion, yes, there is this collaborative governance. There is sharing information and resources across can give governments critical leverage and give a high impact towards achieving their goals. The collaborative governance using the principles of ENBOSS is set to become a Malaysian brand of public policy and public service delivery. This may be just in Malaysia, but I think the case is not peculiar to Malaysia alone. So this collaborative governance could provide some good practice for other governments in grappling with problems similar to Malaysia. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nick. So we've had three presentations, and with a little imagination, we can make some connections between all of them. So I invite comments, questions. We have quite a bit of time till the tea break to do that. You want to start? Yes, please. And
Okay.
just mention to if you wanted all the panelists or anyone to deal with it.
Yes, my question is to Victor, actually. Thank you for a very good presentation. It was very interesting. And I just wanted to mention, there's this museum here in Rio. I think it's called the Museum of Tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, which has, it speaks about technology, and they have these questions which show if you have trust in technology or if you're more of a nostalgic type that prefers to hang on to the past. I just wanted to point that out. And I wanted, also I was wondering while you were presenting if perhaps this trust, as you said, the more trust in technology, the less trust in institutions probably. And if it's actually trust in technology or trust of something that has not been tried. It brings to mind, like even in Egypt with the revolution and the coming to power of the Muslim Brotherhood, how people in the very beginning, they embraced it very happily because it was something that was not tried before. And then later on, they started rejecting it. And maybe with technology, again, as you said, embracing the technology, and then later on, being more critical of perhaps who's in control of this technology, if it will be at any time dysfunctional and so on. And another question is, what about age groups? Is there any difference with regards to age groups, the younger generations as opposed to?
Keep the.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, you might as well answer since I haven't seen any hands. Why don't you answer this question?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for this information about the Museum of Tomorrow. I will go there tomorrow, and it's really interesting about how those two parameters, institutional trust and trust in technology, correlates. I wouldn't say that institutional distrust is the reason, like in a very causal way, of technological trust, or the vice versa, but they just definitely go together. And what is interesting here is that huge Russian state corporations used this kind of technological attitudes in order to improve their public image. For example, two most hated state corporations during many years are Sberbank, which is a Russian major bank, state bank, and Почта России, which is a total disaster. But what is interesting is that this state bank made this kind of very strong effort of technologization. Apple Pay, blockchain, and all the rest, investing a lot of money in fintech and so on. So now, actually, public image of Sberbank is really high as a most probably progressive state corporation ever, because I do not trust to Sberbank, but I trust to Apple Pay in my iPhone. So it's like this kind of technological mediation is something that substitutes this kind of institutional mistrust. I wouldn't probably compare technological revolution to Muslim Brotherhood revolution, right? So I wouldn't say they go together like objects of comparison, but talking about age groups, it's interesting because most, how to say, advanced users of new technologies are not youngest groups, but people who are pre-retirement period. They use those technologies in order to improve their chances in the labor market. So if you're 40 to 50 years old, and you're more advanced user of new technology.
40 to 50, these are the young ones, right?
No, it's not young ones. Sorry, we have expected. You know, average age in Russia, right? Male usually die at 55, 2 years, few years before they retire, right? So it's not even a pre-retirement advancements; it's a pre-death advancements. But anyway, yeah, it's interesting topic about these differences in age groups. Yeah, most technophobic, by the way, is my age group. 30 to 40. Yeah, 30 to 40. The most technophobes are 30 to 40 years old.
Well, thank you. I can't help commenting that in the case of India, in the initial phase with the first Prime Minister, Nehru, there was a lot of trust and faith and hope in technology. But now we are in a situation where any mention of any new technology, the leading people in government will say, oh, we always had it. We already had it. We had, flights. Rama flew to Sri Lanka. We had not just flights from India to Sri Lanka, but we've had intergalactic transportation. It's all recorded in our literature. So there's really nothing new. So the sense of wonder and curiosity that, this is a fantastic thing, this is so amazing, is gone. And so I wonder when, how are you going to get children excited about the Museum of the Tomorrow if you say, oh, well, we've always had it. It's one of the sad things. Over there.
Hello, this is Francisco from RUNEPA, and this is a question for Victor too. As of June, according to the Telegraph, which is a Western media outlet, which is often critical of the Russian government, the president of Russia has an acceptance of over 87%. I'm sorry, the president of Russia has an acceptance over 87%, which is one of the highest in the world. Now, as far as I understand, he's not a robot, nor uses any artificial intelligence tools that the general public may know about. How do you correlate these figures with your research?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure about not robot, but anyway, we measure this institutional trust, including president, parliament, local government, judicial system, and so on. And what is interesting here is that support of president does not correlate with any political institution. So in Russia, president is not a political institution, it's a religious one. So it correlates with a totally different set of attitudes, not with political, not with economic. So he's transcendent to this political system. That's how I would answer your question. That's why when we see this huge decline in institutional trust, especially political institutions during the last 5 years, it was only 5.5% of decline of presidential rating.
Over there.
My name is Nicole. I'm also from RANEPA, and I also have a question for Victor. So, from all these indicators like the Edelman's Trust Barometer and all the others, there, how to say, like diagnostics, they say that there is a problem. But my question is, what would be the pathology of mistrust? Have you seen the reasons behind such low levels of trust in both state institutions and non-acquaintances, let's say, in Russia? I'm curious. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I'd like to ask a question to Nick, actually, but before that, related to your presentation, we recently were involved in a 21 European country survey on the issue of trust. And among the various institutions where institutional trust and interpersonal trust seemed to be very low were religious institutions, churches, monasteries, etc. So I don't know whether you'd like to later on comment on that as well. Nick, how does it work, the coexistence of Sharia courts and secular courts? How are cases sorted out? According to jurisdictional areas, according to types, according to who the perpetrator is, according to who the victim or victims are? How is it sorted out? Could you enlighten us, please?
Rose. Well, since the mic is with Robin, you have the mic.
Okay. Well, I have some short questions for each of you, 2 questions and a comment. For Nick, I saw a little bit of a contradiction that I wonder if you could elaborate on. The principle of collaborative governance is one of those things I think that no one in the room would be against. We all agree it's a positive value. We've been talking about the evils of silos, and this is clearly an effort to coordinate and communicate between government agencies in common shared tasks. But you also suggested that perhaps this is not working well yet, despite numbers of raids and so forth, that businesses that have been raided pop up again, that there's corruption involved. So I'm wondering how you measure the effectiveness of it beyond numbers of raids. For Dina and Leila, just a question I'm interested in. When you talked about 2013 and the beginnings of crackdowns on NGOs, you identified the Adenauer Foundation, Freedom House, and so forth, mainly, or in your case, exclusively Western organizations. But at another point, you said that actually some of this was driven by fear of foreign interference on the Islamic side, presumably from places like Iran and Saudi and other places. So I'm wondering to what extent in 2013, when the large institutional Western organizations were being restricted, were there also similar restrictions on the Islamic groups that were being funded from outside of Egypt? And for Victor, something I'd like to draw you out on, and my long association with you leads me to know about this, but maybe some people in our audience don't. And it's something you might have covered last time at the last conference in Moscow, but I still think it's interesting, and that's the correlation between economic well-being and the responses and trust, and particularly the regional differences, because I always found it very compelling what you said about the contrast between, on the one hand, a global city like Moscow, and on the other hand, Dagestan, where there's a different social structure and a very different economic sense of well-being and the measures there. So those are just comments, questions for all of you.
Yeah, my question is for Victor. The question I want to know is very short. Is it what are the policy implications of your work? I mean, that's the first question. And then the second is on what impact does it have on government, if at all? So those are just the two quick ones.
Thank you. So my question could be for all participants. I feel like I can see how your papers correlate with each other, right? Because we're talking about technology in terms of enabling better governance and more control and how we can monitor each other. But at the same time, there's this need of controlling this means, you know. So I see this tension between, you know, trying to have more transparency and allowing more action on the one hand, and on the other hand, government efforts in terms of controlling, you know, this whole thing. So my question to you is, how do you see this tension and in terms of public policy, in terms of what we can do, and, you know, to try to think of better, you know, governance and institutions that are not, you know, scary.
There's another. Do you have a? Did I miss out any hands? Over there.
First of all, thank you very much for the presentations. They were really good and interesting. My question is for the American professors in Egypt. I was thinking about like the NGOs and civil society, how they are reacting. Like, if you can talk a little bit more about the strategies they were doing against the 2017, the law, and how like this big, like Konrad Adenauer, for example, how they direct, or if there wasn't a reaction considering that Egyptian like workers of projects involving Konrad Adenauer, for example, went to jail. So how was that the alliances or the strategies they had in order to well support these people and well to do something against these strict laws that are being passed? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Balkis from Unirazak. I will just help Prof. Nick by answering Robin's question just now. Okay, with regards to the collaborative governance and why, despite all the rates, it seems like very minimal, not quite minimal impact with regards to the gambling centers and illegal massage parlors. It's actually some sort of a mechanism to get the buy-in from the voters, because the opposition has taken over Selangor, which is next to Kuala Lumpur, and since 2013, there's been mushrooming of illegal beauty parlors and illegal spas. I can say for myself because there is a few illegal spas near my house, and so for the Ministry of Federal Territories, it is something to show to the eyes of the voters, because majority of the voters are grassroots voters with very deep and conservative religious views. So, and with all the media exposure of these rates, the voters would once again vote for the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I will try to collect different pieces of my brain now to answer all that. First of all, thanks for the question about reasons of mistrust. But the problem is that I'm coming from sociology, which is a paranoid discipline. And the very axioms of social sciences, we believe that human in nature, like Thomas Hobbes tried to explain us one day, are very untrustworthy, and mistrust is a natural state of humanity. So trust should be earned. Mistrust is ontological constant, is something what we start with. So for us, mistrust is a quality and trust is achievement. In a world where trust is something ontologically presupposition, public policy would be totally different. That's why actually public policy is becoming a problem, because mistrust is something that you don't have to explain. You just start with this assumption. I know a few disciplines that start with a totally different axiom, but we do not cooperate with them. So it's really interesting about religious institutions. In Russia, when we're trying to measure different levels of mistrust, different degrees of mistrust to different institutions, the funniest part that mistrust to religious institutions very well correlates with religious beliefs, which means that religious institutions in Russia, despite all those recent tendencies, trends, like this kind of conservative religious turn that we have during the last 5 years, despite all of this, public trust to religious institutions is quite low. They're perceived more as institutions than religious. So it also goes back to Soviet past, where Orthodox Church was cooperating with the Soviet regime, and it was kind of blame for them after that. So, so religious institutions are no exceptions. What is interesting is that there is one exception in this the total institutional hate that we have, and this universities. So we have this understanding of trying to produce this kind of explanatory framework that as soon as it goes back to the social capital issues, universities in Russia, universities and army, major machines for producing social capitals, all those weak and strong ties. So as soon as we have very high level of higher education, universities are still keeping this kind of position of banks for social capital. So that's why they're least hated institutions in our society. And unless you don't put President of Russian Federation next to the name of your university, then it changes a little bit situation. So going back to Robin's question about economic regional differences, yes, that's my favorite topic, of course, because all those configurations of weak and strong ties really change economic strategies. And in Dagestan, where average salary is about 25,000 rubles, people can collect 300,000 rubles in 3 days because they have very wide range of social contacts. And this kind of grassroots economy is something that makes totally unnecessary all programs of microloans in banks. They just do not exist in Northern Caucasus, and they're not supported by this public. And in Moscow, people with a much higher salary would go to bank for microloan because they don't have this range of social contacts. But it's a big difference not only between different regions of Russia, but also between different types of urbanization. In urban environment and big cities, the level of social capital is not that high. What is interesting here is that during the last 7 years in the major Russian cities, we had this kind of official policy of investing in public space, investing in public environment in order to raise social capital in big cities. But what is interesting here is that this kind of investment, like let's build more public spaces, right? And then people will go there and will communicate and so on. And that completely collapsed, because what's happened then, as more public spaces you have, then you see that in those cities, Moscow and Kazan mainly, there is a huge growth of social capital, but it's interpersonal trust. And interpersonal trust means that trust to a local government that invested actually in this public space goes down. So you invest in public space, interpersonal trust grows up, institutional trust goes down. So this year is the first time when we see that municipalities are less trusted than even courts. So they're number one now. And especially in those cities that were actually investing in building public place. Sorry. And policy implementations, and yeah, it's a very important question, and I never know how to answer, because I used to say that I'm a researcher, guys. I have no idea what to do. You're about public policy. We are about sociological research, but there are strong political implications. For example, now we run a big project with the World Bank analyzing perspectives of participatory budgeting in Russian regions. And what is interesting here is that participatory budgeting has some chances in less urbanized regions and in the villages, because there is some kind of something that is called community trust, which is a fifth type of trust, where people do not trust each other personally. They do not trust Russian government, of course. They do not trust their local government, of course. They have very low level of institutional trust, but they still believe in some kind of Gemeinschaft, this kind of community that actually can solve problems. So in such type of regions, participatory budgeting funded by World Bank is working. In the cities, it completely failed. So it strikes me how differently this program worked in different types of environment. And another very important policy issue is that that technology is not just an object of trust. It's not something that you just trust to, but it's something that immanently, inherently changed the very idea of what does it mean to be familiar with. It's a border between interpersonal trust and generalized trust is now actually blurring, because the recent case that we analyzed, for example, when women see that some kind of non-government organization on Facebook is collecting belongings for people like in war-affected areas like Donbass in Ukraine, and she gives a lot of things there. Woman is coming, taking them, says thanks, and leave. And 2 weeks later, she finds all her things on Avito. So she is buying them, and the same person who came to her bring it and sell it to her. So this is actually abuse of trust, abuse of public trust, which is a clear thing, right? So, but now we don't know. Is it? She actually didn't know this person personally, but she was on her Facebook list. If someone is your friend on Facebook, does it mean this is interpersonal trust or generalized trust? It's like, where is the border now? If everybody is a bit familiar with everybody, but not familiar so you can say it's more interpersonal, generalized. We don't know. So technological communication actually is not just something that is object of trust, but some kind of instrument of destroying the very distinction between 2 different, majorly, like predominantly different types of trust. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting questions. There was a question about funding, why the funding from Islamist states or organization was not restricted. All what they concentrated on was Western agencies funding the local organizations, whether they are just doing philanthropy work or development work, or they were affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood. All this was under scrutiny and restricted. But there was a lot of ambiguity about sources of funding from Islamic states or Arab countries. It's still ambiguous. Up till the current point in time, we know we're receiving a lot of grants and loans from Arab countries, but it's a totally non-transparent situation. What's coming from where and how it's being used, it's not clear. They were just concentrating on the NGOs in that case. The use of technology and the tension there that Veronica asked about, it's a continuous struggle. So the government is trying to restrict and block certain websites, but this gets the younger generation, and I'm still not the one about to retire or to die, the younger generation in our part of the world, they're the ones who are always more technologically savvy, and they manage to come up with ways to access the blocked websites, proxies, and I don't know, different means and ways to enable people to access the blocked websites. But it's a continuous struggle, I think, and hopefully the younger generation still will be able to win and will be able to have this open access that's very much needed for everything to be part of the global world in general. There was a questions about the strategies. How are the human rights and NGO organizations responding to these restrictions? They're making statements as groups on the social media. They're holding meetings. They're trying to get their voice out to the international community. But this is about it. Still, the law has been passed. The executive regulations will be out soon. And the current situation is that it's a standstill, it's a paralysis for the work of the NGOs, especially those who are interested in human rights or who are interested in democracy issues. Those who are working with mundane issues, acceptable issues they are allowed to be, so long as they are abiding by the law, transparent, getting the necessary security permissions, they're not affiliated to any political party that's against the regime, they will be allowed to operate. But other than that, they're under very close scrutiny, I may say. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add a few points again. With the new law, there are clauses which state that even with permissions, if you do not receive a response within 6 months, that this means a refusal immediately. So previously, sometimes permissions, if there were no responses, that means that just it's a bureaucratic delay. But now with this clearly stated, this further restricts their work. And again, with the requirement to renew permissions and registrations and so on, that means that at any point, any NGO can be stopped if there is a need. So with also with regards to how if Islamic groups and funding and so on, yes, they were kept under scrutiny, and the constitution was more on the foreign funding. But even now, not only the NGOs are kept under scrutiny, but even private investors of the Muslim Brotherhood, their records and their investments are kept under scrutiny as to identify if there is any relation in their business with regards to the Brotherhood's work on the ground. And when we look at even with not only the NGOs, but if we look at the balance of power between market, state, and economy at the moment with market, state, and society, the state has, of course, the growing power at the moment, especially with the private sector even facing other difficulties with the devaluation and with other laws that are being drafted at the moment that are not are creating an imbalance in the region. That's it.
Okay. In responding to Karel's, you're asking Sharia Court, how does it work? In Malaysia, Islam is the official religion, but other religions may also be practiced in harmony in any parts in Malaysia. So it has this unique arrangement that there are two courts. One is the civil court, and the other is the Sharia court. The civil court is to deal with the federal matters, and the Sharia court is to deal with Islamic matters. And mostly this is in the state courts. The federal court is the civil courts. And you are asking what happens if you have this is Muslim and non-Muslim? Is that what you're asking? Am I right?
Yes, I mean, it's both imagining that in a particular court case, there are individuals from two different religions, one case. Then there is a geographical jurisdiction that certain laws are applied in certain areas and not in others. And if there is a conflict between individuals of different religions vis-a-vis the state, what happens?
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, the Sharia court deals mainly with family matters, divorces, and also land matters. The rest are tried in the civil court. And in 1988, there was a lot of contentious issue about this, but in the 1988, there was an introduction to Amendment Article 121 of Constitution that says that the civil court shall have no jurisdiction in respect of any matter within the jurisdiction of the Sharia court. So Sharia court is very limited. This only deals with family matters, as I said, divorces, and also on land matters, because these are the jurisdiction of the state. When come to federal matters, it is dealt with in the civil court.
Thank you.
Can I respond to Robin's? Although Balkis has, but I want to express add further. When I mentioned just now that they have made little impact, it was before the collaborative governance, when each of these agencies and ministries conduct raid by themselves, and they have very restricted powers, and the impact is very low. And so sometimes, faced against these very rich businesses, they pay their way, and the next few days they are back in business. And sometimes those confiscated machines are there back again on business, with the numbers, with the serial number and all, meaning that there has been some exchange of payments. But when they do it in tandem, in a collaborative manner, it's not only that it gives impact, but each agencies and ministries are also watching each other for corruption practice. So they become watchdog for each other as well, besides collaborating for the common good. Thank you.
Little time for any further thoughts, comments? Yes, sure.
My question is to Leila and Dina, because it's really interesting what you're talking about, this restrictive legislation, because in Russia we also have Foreign Agent Act, which is exactly a tool to destroy and cripple all NGOs that have foreign funding. But it's interesting that, of course, we know this kind of legislation is drama enough, but also another problem, which is selective law enforcement. So not all NGOs who got foreign funding probably were persecuted. So we can do this kind of research analyzing particular groups of NGOs that were attacked first. Because it's interesting that you mentioned International Republican Institute, which is basically the US Republican Party, and Konrad Adenauer Foundation, because in Russia we first destroyed NDI, which is National Democratic Institute, which is basically US Democratic Party. And in terms of German intervention, it was Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and Friedrich Naumann Foundation. So it looks like you took care of right-wing parties and we took care of left-wing organizations, right? So we can share it, and a lot of things in common. But what is interesting, if we are talking not in terms of political spectrum, but in terms of type of organization, first, of course, organizations who were involved in electoral monitoring. They were shut down first, because actually the very Foreign Agent Act was produced to shut down electoral monitoring organization. Second, independent research centers. Two independent sociological research centers were shut down right after that. And third, universities. The European University of St. Petersburg, which is very similar to American University in Cairo, was a third victim. And it was shut down last year. So I have a very simple and short question. How is American University in Cairo doing?
And good comments that the similarities between different countries around the world, and when we were doing the research, we read how similar legislation is existing in Russia, in China, and it's acceptable that the government should have scrutiny and should get to know where the funding is coming from, and the organizations are expected to report. But it's the manner that these laws are being enforced, how selective they are, what's permissible and what's not. So I assume that there are other movements who are not really completely registered, and they still accept a lot of funding and donations from within and from without. But since they are in support of the government, this is allowed to happen, and nothing about it completely. American University in Cairo, we're going to celebrate our centennial 100 years of operation soon. We started in 1919. And we've managed to stay open even during the socialist era of Nasser. I think how they managed to do it is that through a government agreement that there should be a representative of government working closely with the top level administration, and this position is still kept. We have a counselor, an Egyptian former official, usually a minister who retires, and then he's appointed by the government to work closely with the administration as a counselor. It started in the socialist era, but currently the role of that counselor is to make sure that we are on good terms with the government and that we're not breaking any laws, and hopefully we'll be able to continue operation. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in 1976, India legislated the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, and that was during a state of emergency which lasted for a couple of years. And Parliament was then told that the justification for this law is really to control money that came from Saudi Arabia and Arab regions, financing Urdu language newspapers and pamphlets that were
Not Urdu. It must have been the funding from Iran.
No. It's not Iran. It's Arab. That was the explanation given. But in effect, what happened, and this is a sort of should interest public policy people, there was no way the government could track this kind of financing, because this was done through a modality that's known as the hawala. So it is not through banking transactions and so on. So, and the hawala, has, you telephone somebody in Kabul or in, Riyadh, and, one call and money is transferred at another place to other people. So there's no way so this was the initial justification, except that stated objective was never realized, but it came in handy to control NGOs. So currently the government gets disturbed if Greenpeace objects to India's nuclear development, or if Amnesty International or says something about how the government is dealing with leftist militants, then you have the means to clamp down on it. So the original objective was not met, but the law on the books has been increasingly tightened in the sense of in a bureaucratic way. As you mentioned, you are late in submitting your annual report by 1 month, and therefore you've technically violated the law, therefore your registration is cancelled. So things like that keep happening. So that's, I think everywhere. But in reaction to it, there's also been a strong surge of civil society activism, criticizing the government for doing this and accusing the government of indulging in petty vendetta. What the darling institution of the government of India since 1952 has been the Ford Foundation. But when Mr. Modi became Prime Minister, somebody told him that the Ford Foundation had funded Arvind Kejriwal, the person who won New Delhi. And in New Delhi, the new party created by this individual won 77 seats out of the 80 there is. And so Mr. Modi had campaigned personally, only 3 seats. So this was a big humiliation. But this chief minister, Kejriwal, had been funded by the Ford Foundation because he had been in an earlier phase a great champion of the right to information. And his NGO had pushed that. And another organization, and she's on our faculty, adjunct faculty, called Teesta Setalwal. She's a lawyer, she teaches. Her organization in Gujarat very diligently pursued cases against the ministers, the Home Minister and the police, who were responsible for a big program against Muslims living in Ahmedabad and other parts of Gujarat. And the Home Minister in Mr. Modi's cabinet was convicted and sent to jail on the basis of evidence marshaled by this group of lawyers. And so she's being persecuted now. Her registration for foreign contributions has been cancelled. There are several cases that have been filed against her and so on. But then the interesting thing is that, there she is. She comes and gives lectures to our students. The state has given her a kind of not an armed guard, but a guard who is not in uniform, who accompanies her because she's received so many threats from Hindu communal groups that her life is in danger. And so the state has provided that support. At the same time, the cause of all this is, of course, the political leadership in the country not being happy with such activities. So, we get all these things, but it's interesting to see some patterns across our countries, and then phases in time. I mean, why is it that certain things are happening in this age? And I think that's a larger question to reflect upon, because all of these, in a way, are symptoms of a certain, want of faith. I mean, I would say you began with trust. I mean, Isaiah Berlin wrote this book called The Crooked Timber, which is a passage from Immanuel Kant, who said, out of this crooked timber, nothing straight can ever be made. But on the other hand, we are all self-interpreting agents. And if you know that, we are essentially crooked timber and therefore must make an effort to be better as human beings, there's grounds for optimism. So on that optimistic note, I'll say there's a coffee break is upon us, and we'll reconvene. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you sit in the audience and on the panel, listen to them, you can see their PowerPoints. It's easier to do that. But in a way,
Ellison, que é o que cuida do som, ele não teve tempo justamente por causa da inclusão dessa mesa. Então, ele não teve tempo de organizar isso aqui, porque tem que puxar cabo, tem que puxar o cabo, tem que soltar o chão, muito assim. Até o pessoal voltar, ele não teria tempo. Entendeu? E aí, se deslocar um microfone, depois vai ficar ruim também para poder posicionar de volta.
How are you?
No, they are. No, you can sit there. Yeah. You can then see the PowerPoints. Yeah. She's there. Excuse me. Oh, okay. We have to change seats. Oh, what? We just change seats. Welcome back. We continue with this panel. We have two speakers, Dipanshu Mohan, my colleague from UP Jindal University, and Vivian Fonseca. So I'll request Dipanshu to begin with this presentation.
All right. A very good morning, everyone. It's been a fantastic 4 days of exceptional learning and interactions with colleagues from different parts of the world coming in all together and this gathering. I guess one of the most amazing or insightful aspects of the entire trip has been the conversations that we've had over our breakout sessions during the times of lunch, breakfast, and dinner. And the stories that we've been able to communicate about anecdotes from different parts of the country. So often one would say that this is a situation happening back home, and in response, you'll automatically have a colleague of yours telling, well, exactly, this is something which is also happening or also used to happen at a certain point of time. So the stories that we can do communicate to each other, enrich and enhance our perspectives a lot. So I thank IDPPA, Dr. Lewis, Dr. Celsa, Veronica for the hospitality and the hosting of this event. Beginning on the note of stories and narratives, this work that I'm about to present is a recent effort to break the armchair economists' interpretation of kind of doing desktop research or using psychometric tools to use existing methods to go on the field and see exactly what's happening. So the structuring of the presentation is going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to start with research questions, introduction, outline. It's going to be actually bottom up. So you'll have findings in a way kind of thrown out first, what one tends to find on the field, what's exactly that we're trying to get after, the questions that are coming from the field, right? And the methodological questions that one can ask in terms of experimenting with methods, and what is that we've come across over the last 7 to 8 months of research on this project. So one of the first things that I wanted to kind of bring out was the brief outline of what or how the structuring would happen. And I use the word narratives here as stories of not only individual people, but as stories of illustrative examples that one can cite to get a good perspective on what's happening when we look at markets, for example. The study is based in the city of New Delhi. New Delhi, as you would know, pretty much like Rio, from whatever little I could see, has a very widely fragmented consumption class, if I can use the word. That means people from different income groups are going to different sources of markets to be able to purchase. So if you want a nice earring, you go to a mall. If you want a nice flip-flop, well, you don't want to go to a mall. You may end up going to one of the convenience street market vendors and get that. One of the insightful things that I recently saw, it was yesterday, was that a lot of the street markets set up near Copacabana Beach is of people from Ecuador. A lot of the local vendors there are not from the Rio itself, but they've traveled all the way, and we were trying to get some questions inside. So I'll try presenting a bit of that and what is happening in Delhi. We identified around 3 to 4 markets in 3-4 different zones of the city. And these zones were identified based on the consumption class. So South Delhi is the highest per capita consumption class. In other words, the elites are most or less on an aggregate residence there. Old Delhi, which is the northern part of Delhi, that's where most of the Mughal Sultanate, markets from the time of almost 17th to 18th century have been there. East Delhi, which is where a lot of the migrated population is settled. So you'll get different perspectives out of this. The second aspect of the presentation would largely look at, am I audible? Yeah. So the second aspect of the presentation would look at the experimentation with methods of research investigation. I guess this is extremely important because a lot of times we consume methods to be very static in their nature and content, but methods also evolve as the study and our field investigation went. So a lot of the methodological lessons that we were learning was largely coming out from our observations in the field. This project involved around 6 to 7 people, but I was involved as the principal investigator, and there were a few colleagues of ours from other organizations in Delhi. So I'll speak a little bit of that. And because this is a delegation of IDPPA, I wanted to also draw in some lessons for and within the understanding of policy epistemology. I've already mentioned this earlier in the student workshop, that policy should not only be seen as technocratic exercise of implementation, should also be seen, or could also be seen as ways of knowing. What does that mean? It can be seen as a body of knowledge which is functionally and operationally independent of any other discipline as well. You can use disciplines to use or get anecdotes, but one should not look at only from a technique of implementation. So what are the snapshots that one can find from these identified projects? These were the 5 basic questions that one went to field with. And these are an evolving list of questions, but these questions are not questions with respect to a particular aspect. For any business to be consistent, sustainable in nature, you need these 5 Ps, and these 5 Ps have evolved from aspects of looking at financial inclusion in different parts of the world. So having a good price for the product that you're saying, having a good product for what business you're doing, what is the position at which you're trying to sell the product. The location matters a lot, right, in a given market. Protection, that is in terms of the protection received or the regulatory systems received or facilitation received from the local government and state authorities. And what's the profitability? I mean, one should not forget that profits or incentives are the only way in which markets can only sustain on its own, right? So these 5 Ps help us in building some form of an investigative architecture for our design. So I'll start with these 5 Ps and we'll come back to this. The first aspect of the price looked at questions on to what extent in markets within Delhi, bargaining power plays a very important role. So how well you negotiate. Yesterday we started with a price for a flip-flop from 30 real, and it came down to what, 5 real or 6 real? It was just about negotiation. How well can you negotiate or bargain the price of product has nothing to do with demand and supply. It's just basically the customer to vendor relationship. Product, what is the nature of the product? Well, of course, quality matters, but how is that a particular individual, right, in these markets are able to procure these products from different parts of the areas? It's not like a big company which has a different retail division, has a different wholesale division, has a different procurement division. In fact, most of these activities are being done by these individuals or people as a part of a group itself. Position matters a lot, so speciality plays a huge role to play. But speciality means primarily the location of where the market is set up and also where the individual is. I'll come to the protection and profitability part. So let's start with the first market, and this is the market of Delhi Hart. For those who've traveled to Delhi, I think you would have to visit one of these spaces anyway. Delhi Hart is one of those posh located markets set up in the southern part of the city. There's a regulated government designated area of land where vendors are allowed to get stalls for a good 15 days. There's a committee that manages it. So one can call it as more of a semi-regulated segment, but there's no regulation on transactional records, credit records, nothing. Most of the transactions are in cash and are subject to heavy price negotiations, right? The only fixed price that you'll find is markets telling you very exactly that this is the fixed price of a particular product, no bargaining, right? So this is located in the southern part of the city. What is that you see is a bit more of a well carved out area. You can walk around easily. It's not pretty chaotic. And most of the products that are seen to be sold are state or community-led comparative advantages. So you have a team from Kashmir who sells pashmina shawls. You have people from different parts of Bihar selling paintings or homemade meetings. A lot of the state-based products are put across for sale in this particular market. That's Delhi Hart. So you have products here for which there are multiple sellers. There are products for which you have very few sellers. Multiple sellers mean more than 5 to 6 of them are selling the same product. Few sellers mean primarily those who are 3 or 4 vendors that are doing that. I'm using the word vendors as primarily market agents. So there is no connotation of informality, formality I'm drawing right here, right? The third is those who are single sellers. So they have a certain form of a monopoly on the sale of these toys. That means they are higher priced and there's less room for negotiation or bargaining. Most of the products, as you see, are commodities or of consumer goods. In other words, those which have a longer or a shorter lifespan of consumption. Paintings, you have more or less architectural products, and this is what is showcased in this particular market. So there's been a lot more of regulation that the state has been able to provide for these market agents. The supply dynamics plays a bit more of an interesting role. Raw materials are procured from people who are coming from these states. They're actually traveling all the way, spending some time in the city, and getting these products with them when they're traveling either by train, bus, or even by their own mode of transport. So all of this procurement is happening on their own raw materials. Manufacturing is taking place for some of them, which are mostly homemade products like paintings, at their own sources. And distribution tends to happen primarily at the local level. There are not many wholesalers or retailers. It's just basically a family that is trying to run through this. So the objective of this, for example, slide is to give you an idea that supply chain or logistics management or inventory management are not concepts that you only need to study while talking about formal, sophisticated retail or fast-moving consumer goods segment. You can also study these concepts when you're subjecting them to a different environment of market. So this helps an idea. So this is Shabir. I'll just read out a little bit of what Shabir does and Shabir's idea is. Shabir Jan is a vendor in Delhi Hart. He's 32 years old and is a resident of Kashmir. That's the state of Jammu and Kashmir right up in the north. He's a shawl vendor who also sells other woolen items in Delhi Hart and has been in this business for the last 15 years. His business is a family-owned business and was started by his grandfather. So there's a certain legacy that's there. He sets shop in Delhi Hart only for a period of 15 days. You can't set for a shop for more than 15 days. There's a lottery system. You have to win a lottery to be able to set it up. And apart from Delhi Hart, which is something that is subject to him winning the lottery, is that he sets up his shop or market in different parts of the countries in various trade fairs, right? So he does not have a designated space. In the report that we filed, we call these vendors as floating vendors. They're floating from one space to another space over a period of time, and they don't have a centered area of operation or market activity. Shabir sources his raw materials from Kashmir, has employed karigars. Karigars is a word for craftsmen, to embroider the cloth. He started his business that was mostly on a self-manufacturing basis, and there was a room for negotiation he had of craftsmen who were mostly members of his own family. The selling price in Delhi Heart used to have all expenses incorporated in it, which included the transportation cost, usually rupees 50, less than $1 per kg, via courier from Srinagar to Delhi. So he's getting most of his raw material couriered from the state to Delhi itself. Rental cost in Delhi Heart, that's the rent that he's paying for the services used. It costs around 9,000 to 10,000. Cost of staying in Delhi for a period of 15 to 20 days. So a lot of these floating vendors need accommodation, and most of them are either habited by slums, or those who are working in Delhi Heart can manage a bit more of a hotel in Paharganj, let's say. It's an old part in Delhi. Apart from that, he priced his products at a margin of 20% of profit. So Shabir is a rich man, if you look at the profitability of what he's getting. He stated that even though negotiation happens in Delhi Heart, he sells his most product with a minimum profit margin of 15 to 20% and does not negotiate with the consumer below this price. Okay. This is keeping in mind that he has around 16 to 17 competitors selling the same product within Delhi Heart itself, within the same market. According to him, competition never affected his pricing significantly, and his sales are highest at the time of the weekend and seasonal migration or seasonal points. The situation that seems to have affected in India, it's primarily after November last year, is a policy announcement that came in the form of demonetization, which was to pull out most of the cash of the economy. I don't know if you're already aware of it, but if you just Google demonetization in India, you'll have a string of articles come in. So 500 and 1,000 rupee notes were pulled out, and in return, everyone was kind of asked abruptly to shift to digital modes of payment. So Shabir's main mode of transaction was or used to be cash. This changed post-demonetization, which was on the 8th of November 2016. He now takes credit cards. Online transactions take place through digital payments like Paytm. He still pays his craftsmen, though, in cash and prefers cash transactions wherever possible. An interesting observation that was made was when asked that what is the support you need from the government or local development authorities, of course, he mentioned that a bit more of help in space or allocation of space to continue his business would be better. Apart from that, there was nothing else that Shabir mentioned of. So that's Delhi Heart. That's the elite of Delhi where they can go to shop. Wednesday Bazaar. Now, why is it called the Wednesday Bazaar? Wednesday Bazaar means it's a weekly market set on a given day of the week and set within few hours. So 5 to 8 p.m. are the hours of operation of this market, and it's set up in East Delhi. The market started with people coming who were migrants to the city to sell basic goods. The market, it works in a very interesting way. There is absolutely no support for these vendors, of course. They're setting up their stalls in a flurry for an area of around 1 kilometer. There is basically, if you see, look at the picture on the right, there's this wooden architectural plank that they have. They have to get that plank. And there is, on the left, you see there is an LED light, which they get. This LED light is around $200 in the market. So that takes care of them for light. That's the basic infrastructural logistics, and in terms of how they are storing the product right there. So this weekly Heart market has, and its peak time or rush time, around a size of more than 1,100 to 1,200 people in the market. It's virtually impossible conducting interviews or asking people questions here. What are the main goods that are sold in this weekly market? Mostly consumer goods, cotton apparel, everything. I mean, you can find a TV remote control. From that, you can find it almost anything. You can find cotton apparels, you can find plastic wares. And a lot of time the transactions take place. I buy something and I say, the consumer asks or the seller asks, do you want a bit more of cutlery? That means you want 4 cups. I said, well, I don't need cups. I said, I don't have the change. Can you take 3 cups? And that's the barter. So I just got reminded of how barter system evolved in ancient times. And you still see barter working in these systems. This is how the market looks. This is one shop, just one shop, giving you an idea of the range of products that a particular vendor may have, right, in this particular market. People love going there. They may find it extremely chaotic to do business, but the range of products that they get in a certain price is fascinating. So the market has thrived as a result of how people have made it to thrive. It's not as if that these vendors are only using it as basics of substances, right? How does the supply chain logistics work? Most of these people are, again, a part of floating vendors. Because it's a weekly market, a lot of these are setting up a weekly market in East Delhi on one day, South Delhi on one day, north of Delhi in one day, and west of Delhi in one day. So they are moving around the corner almost all parts of the week. And that's how the trailing is happening. A lot of them are procuring goods within the city, selling it at a higher price. In other words, I want something, instead of taking it from Amazon or ordering it online, I'd rather go downstairs and see the shop right there, buy it at a cheaper price itself. So it's a very different form of a market architecture of sorts, right? Now, Ashok, who is a vendor there in the weekly market in Mayur Vihar, that's east of Delhi, has been in this business for the last 25 to 30 years. He's been selling cotton apparel clothes. He sets up a shop for cotton wear for children in various markets around Delhi on 4 days a week, but all 4 days in a different space. Right? However, with the change in season, he shifts to other businesses as well. He has been a helper at shops. He's worked in the informal sector so as to when he was young. So he was selling tea, coffee. So he's moved on from one activity to the other. And from there, he's shifted to selling vegetables as well when the need arises. He laments about the fact that market has slowed down considerably after demonetization, which is basically November 2016 again, but has not picked up in the last 4 months, but it's now suddenly gaining ground over the last couple of weeks. He refuses to use digital transactions, so he still prefers payment in cash, which is what he needs to get for local procurement of goods. He hopes for a better government that is going to able, I'm just paraphrasing what he's saying, this is not my opinion, right? For better government which help vendors like him and count him as an equal stakeholder in the economic development of the country. However, he states that due to the class he belongs to, and primarily is looking at where he's coming in from, the social background, there is no one who listens, and he does not have the system where he can provide the right amount of feedback. He stated that the operating cost of his business is significantly high, but as a result of being in this floating vendor operational dynamics, he's been able to afford private education for his children, educate them, and one of his kids, that's his son, works at an American bank. One of his daughters is married and is working as a chartered accountant. I don't know if you know, but in India, chartered accounting process takes a good 4 to 5 years. They send him money to be able to have a comfortable life, but he says that he continues to put up the shop as there's nothing else or better to do. He just enjoys the business because he's been doing that for the last 30 years, right? So that's Ashok's picture. The third. Now, Old Delhi is fascinating because this has a very strong social and cultural history. The closest resemblance I can find is the chaotic markets in Istanbul that I often read about. And you see that in Delhi as well. It's the northern part of the city, which can be seen as a periphery now, because when the British kind of redesigned the city while they were moving the capital from Calcutta to Delhi, redesigned the entire city, so a lot of people were pushed to this periphery. This is chaotic, but there are more than 50 markets that are present in a spatial distance of less than 1 kilometer. So that means there are 50 indigenous markets selling different kinds of products. So Meena Bazaar, Chavri Bazaar, all of these are bazaars. Bazaars are seen as markets within the same region itself. This is just at a time where you can see this, the market with least amount of people. This is the least number of people that you can find, that you can take the picture. It was difficult for me to even take pictures when you're doing the interviews because you're constantly pushed back, but the demand is extremely high. Now, one of the interesting part of these markets, the way they have evolved, the old Delhi markets, is that most of these markets are selling resaleable items, old books, old scrap materials, that is for motors and automobiles. And the motor market is the one that attracts the maximum attention. You can get a second-wheeler car or a second-wheeler two-wheeler at almost 1/4 the price, and there's a huge demand for this. It's virtually impossible asking questions there, because a lot of the trade that they're doing is not in quote-unquote legal terms. So they all are skeptical on what questions you're asking, but they are talking about scrap material that people are ignoring. They're picking it up from the waste areas, and they're trying to give it a certain polishing and work it. There's a huge demand for the market, and it works of its own way. So that's the supply chain logistics. A huge area for food cutlery. So most people go to Old Delhi because they want to try the exceptional food, the non-veg cuisine, and it's pretty delicious. Also quite unhealthy, but it's pretty delicious to look at. And that's something which Old Delhi kind of has a comparative advantage of. For more links on the report itself, I just wanted to put it out there so that you have an idea of what is that we did. It's a 50-page report, so it takes a lot of analysis of detailed aspects. Now, what is that you get an idea of from these 3 market case studies or stories of these people or vendors who are operating right here? The first, which is that there is a certain limitation, because one asks me a very methodological question, what was your sampling method? And the idea seems to be very clear here. You can't use a uniform sampling method for each of these markets. It's a different market. It's a different context. There's a different consumption class. There's a different product basket. And you cannot use that for the markets that you're covering. So for every market, we need to tweak our sampling design and method to understand how is that can be best covered. So no aggregate sampling, no use of randomized controlled trials. It's a fascinated term now, which a lot of economists and psychologists and different people are wanting to use. Convert everything into a scientific lab and try asking questions based on this. It may be a good idea to do that, but if using it as a universal prescription has problems. And I think in at least the study we were doing, RCTs could not be experimented. You cannot neutralize the vendor's venue. If I'll ask him to come to the university to respond to questions, his responses are likely to change as against doing it on the field itself. So the first thing that one tends to find out what in terms of methodological limitations is that there are some inherent biases and blunders that we often ignore in the way we are going about these research investigations. There are people who've talked about it. Kahneman and Tversky's work in the 70s started looking at this. And that's something which one needs to be cognizant of while we are going and planning the study itself. The second is a mathiness problem. I haven't given you complex numbers to give you an idea of the context of the problem. All one needs to do is give in a contextual understanding of one or few vendors who are selling the same products, and you'll have the scenario built about to understand where is the policy or where is the reform that you can work about with. The third is the contextual laxity. Most of the research that we were doing on the subject involved us to only look at contexts of a very different nature. So that was something that we found that it was lacking, at least in the literature that we were seeing. I mean, I'm not saying that every literature was not covering it. We had a paper by Anand Roy and a few other scholars who worked on markets in Calcutta, but it was not something that we could use universally for other econometric techniques. So what is that, or how is that we can innovate upon? Let's look at a solution prescript example. Ethnographic techniques of 2 kinds really helped us. One was the participant observer approach. Go to the market, spend some time. In other words, when I'm shooting a film, I would like to do a recce, go into the space, familiarize myself, and see where the cameras have to be put. In a very similar context, go into the field, spend some time, know which markets you want to identify and how is that you can go about it. Second was a semi-structured interviewing. If I'm going with 10 questions, I'm asking 10 questions, I'm getting response to 10 questions, I don't know anything about the person over and beyond that. Start a conversation, bring those questions in alignment of the conversation, but let the person respond to a lot of things. There's a lot that one can learn from the interview in addition to what one is asking. So these 2 methods really help. Now, where do you find these methods? Not in economics, in the discipline of economics, the way it is taught, but in anthropology. So you have an interdisciplinary approach of economic anthropology, looking at David Graeber's work, and a number of scholars who've done similar ways to understand or use different methods. Now, I'll just take a few more minutes to work on looking at the lessons, and this is towards the last part of the presentation. Okay, thank you. The first is, and I think now a lot of research is going on how national street vendors act or how law and development works in that purview. One of the limitations, and we had one part of the study which was focusing only on the legality aspect of urban dynamics of these markets. And the issue was, well, the judiciary has provided a protection for most of these floating vendors, or people who are moving across different spaces. And the implementation of that National Street Vendors Act has to be seen upon. And the answer to this lies in the next slide, which I'll come in. But you cannot expect the law to, by its own course, to be allowed for looking at issues of subsistence and livelihood beyond a protective mechanism. It can allow for protective to these people or protection to these people, but not as if that they are the others amongst, not for those who are not a part of it. The second aspect is to take a more inclusive view to understanding the nature of urban informality, the way in which we understand it, beyond its operational form, and going beyond a dual outlook. Often discussions start, this is formal, you have a mall which is a formal aspect, and there's an informal duality. If we start with that dualistic lens itself, it becomes difficult to deal with most of these cases by its own. So you need an inclusive framework. The hyperlinked article provides you an entire structure to work around with. So what kind of policies do you need to work upon in trying to ensure what these individual market agents need is secured? First, try not having policies that are consequentially independent of what consequences are. Demonetization is or was or can be seen as a disaster for the thriving of market activities. I shudder to think why a lot of countries are trying to imitate the same. They're saying that we should try the same thing to look at. There is no record now that any part of black money or alternative sources of money were brought into the system. In fact, it worsened the disrupted markets across the cities. It can be seen as a consequentially independent approach. Does not think of consequences, does not think of comprehensive outcomes. It's just something that you want to do because it sounds good as an experiment to work around with. Now, that's where you need policy experimentation to be largely consequentially sensitive. Bring the agencies who can enforce this, also see the agents that are there. It's the human responses that you have to have a sensitive approach of. The second is bring the narratives into the concern. If you're trying to experiment it or pilot test it, individual narratives of what people are saying, not everyone needs price determination mechanisms. Most people were talking about an aspect that we find with the business that we're doing. All what we need is a space to be able to conduct our market activity. Till the time we get that space, that's fine. We don't need anything else from the government or the local development authorities. Or stop asking us for bribes, which some of the market vendors give us an idea of. The third is the countervailing measures. Now, countervailing measures means that, okay, we've had a policy or a reform announced, but you need a feedback mechanism to see if it's working or not. So you do, in other words, we talk about largely project monitoring and evaluation and most of this. Well, you need to do that at a more regular base to see if it's working or not working, in what context. So we were talking about yesterday on bus rapid transport systems, technology implementation. I guess all 3 points helps us in helping in bringing most of these issues into context. IDPPA and lessons in policy epistemology, taking an inclusive approach to development discourse. Now, this is something which I wanted to kind of look at in a theoretical framework. I think most discourses in the way we're trying to understand development suffers from these 5 critiques, right? And these 5 critiques are largely responsible for issues related to how policy implementation, design, epistemology of in terms of the body of knowledge of public policy making is looking at. The first is the interpretative critique. We don't know what is development, right? We're confusing the words of growth and development in the same light. Growth can be seen as a means to achieve a certain amount of development, and development would be seen as an expansion of human capabilities that is allowing for those. It's an end in itself, while growth would be seen as a means. There's a huge body of literature is trying to argue towards this, so I don't want to get into this, but we can have a discussion after. So there's an interpretative critique. The second is a justification or a pertinence critique. Why is it important? Well, it is important because the people who are providing you the goods and are selling the goods are the most important recipients of the policies you look at. So this is looking at the justification of pertinence critique. Implementation critique sounds, you have brilliant plans, you have a brilliant rhetoric that you create, and we have, I think, the best designed in verbal prose plans. Some of the plans that we've seen from the Planning Commission, first Planning Commission till the 13th or 14th Planning Commission, are very well-written plans. They're not bad plans in the way. Some of them were MIT economists who were coming in counseling, but none of them were looking at the implementation scenarios in place while looking at what needs to be done. So there is a hope versus reality conundrum that affects. The fourth aspect is the accessibility critique. Now, accessibility critique looks at for whom is that the policy is being planned upon. Are accessibility mechanisms ensured only to the bureaucracy that is working, or also to the people who are going to be receiving it? I'm only talking about the producer or a supply side perspective here, but consumers also need to be brought in terms of their own cycle. And the last but not the least is the agency critique. Who's the agency of implementation? Most of our context of plans is the bureaucracy, which does a dismal job in understanding what the market needs. One of the criticisms that we highlighted was the inadequate implementation of the township vending committees that were mandated to be created by the National Street Vendors Act. Because there are no committees in place, there's just one municipal authority which is guaranteeing an area of 10 kilometers, and becomes impossible for this municipality to understand what the market vendors need. By that, I'll probably want to end the presentation, and thank you for this opportunity to come in. I hope we can have a longer discussion thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very useful to have your 4 critiques, which we can discuss. So, Vivian, the floor is yours.
So, hello, good morning. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here yesterday. I was presenting a paper in another conference. So today I will talk about rights and social inclusion, focused in the case of intangible heritage policies. Well, in Brazil, until late 90s, heritage policies were directed towards preserving material goods, leaving behind several other cultural manifestations deriving from popular culture. During the same decade, During the same decade, there were profound debates concerning manifestations that could be understood as heritage. These debates stimulated government officials to create the Immaterial Heritage Registry, as well as the Immaterial Heritage National Program, linked to the National Historic and Artistic Heritage Institute, known as IFAM, the Brazilian organ responsible for identification and preservation of our national cultural and historical heritage. From 2000 to 2004, in the Intangible Heritage Program, first 14 years, IFAM have recognized 30 popular cultural manifestations as national heritage. It's 20, but I made a mistake. It's 30. Okay. The first registers were held during the administration of Minister Francisco Vefor in the Fernando Henrique Cardoso government, both in 2002. Cohesive art, body painting, and graphic art YAP related to the native knowledge. Yeah, I'm smaller. Okay. Related to the native knowledge of the YAP villages in the state of Amapá, and the savoir-faire of Paneleiras de Goiabeiras. This one, this picture is this one. It's women that made a pen, yeah, in a crafty way. So, Paneleiras de Goiabeiras in Espírito Santo, which concerns the knowledge of artisan production of clay pots. As described by IFAM in the Registry of Cultural Assets database, as the case of cohesive art and Paneleiras savoir-faire, is also associated with a native knowledge. The tradition category finds its centrality in the intangible heritage preservation policy. However, unlike material heritage, this tradition, to be patrimonialized, must continue to be a cultural reference in the present of these social groups. After the registry, IFAM elaborates the safeguarding plans, and these plans aims to define and organize a group of actions willing to enhancing social environmental production, as well as reproduction and transmission conditions of the registered cultural immaterial heritage. Today, the present work seeks to discuss the extent to which notions of social inclusion are visible in Brazilian immaterial heritage policies between 2000 and 2004. This paper also aims to analyze the social inclusion proposed dimension in the government's policies. As policy focused on popular culture manifestations, areas of intangible heritage are often associated with a process of rights, access by social segments that for a long period of Brazilian history were marginalized and had their rights denied. In addition to the symbolic recognition, registering these manifestations set up safeguard plans for groups associated with these cultural assets that involve areas such as work, housing, health, social security, among others. In this sense, it seeks to analyze to what extent those intangible heritage policies have been effective in the construction of public procedures that promote access to rights and, most of all, to a more inclusive society. Legally, how patrimonialized intangible heritage become possible? With the federal decree 3551 of August 2000, no, I'm a historian, very bad with numbers. This decree created the Registry of Immaterial Cultural Goods and the Immaterial Heritage National Program mentioned before and under IFAM responsibility. The registry appears as the principal preservation action and also one of the best ways to recognize cultural diversity in Brazil. This program, as it is written in the official document, makes possible identification, promotion, and safeguarding plans of cultural goods. The immaterial goods have their registries officially recognized with their enrollment in one of the books of registry. Unlike what happens with the material heritage that once recognized as heritage, it does not need to be ratified periodically. Immaterial goods, every 10 years from its registry, needs to be confirmed. In this action, the cultural good must have its registry ratified if it continues to represent an important cultural reference for the community where it was produced. As described in the text of the decree, the inscription of the registry books will always reference the historical continuity of the cultural good and its relevance to the national memory, identity, and formation of Brazilian society. In this conception, the immaterial heritage is considered as a dynamic expression and so can be changed by its producers. Considering that, if the communities do not have the will to continue with the cultural expression, there is the possibility of extinction. Thus, one of the challenges of the safeguarding plan is precisely help the community to keep practicing their cultural goods, to have the conditions to do it. The action of the registry also produces the commitment of the Brazilian government in inventory and support as well through the safeguarding plans. In contrast to the previous period of preservation policy, with the institution of the registry action, the conception of the savoir-faire protection gets importance, and the concept of process and cultural practice began to be seen as important cultural goods. The immaterial goods, knowledge, allows individuals to experience and recreate the traditions in the present, since these events are characterized precisely by permanent updating. The notion of immaterial heritage, according to the specialists, gives visibility to issue of incorporating different cultural process in public policy relating to culture, as well as provides a discussion of the memory, reference, and identity that the country produces for itself and in dialogue with other nations. Even though the registry is an outstanding action, it's known, however, that it not represent the end of a cycle. On the contrary, it's the beginning of a process in which the state compromises itself in safeguarding a cultural good identified with social practice. The next step includes the formulation and implementation of the safeguarding plans. Safeguarding measures uses as formulation base the knowledge produced about the cultural expression during the goods inventory process and posterior registry. It should be noted that safeguarding plans do not have a predefined model. Each case requires a differentiated approach according to a specific cultural, political, economic, and social elements of the goods. So it's really hard to the IFAM to make it possible. This customization of safeguarding plans is often a challenge to IFAM staff that at various times is not familiar with the specific codes of this cultural expression. It can happen by various reasons: too much work, lack of time, different degrees of affinity with the theme, not knowing the specific codes, and you have in Brazil few employees to deal with it. And when it occurs, ends up posing as difficult or obstacle to the establishment of safeguarding plans. This was just one of the obstacles in the formulation of the various safeguarding plans analyzed. It should be impossible to analyze all of the 30 intangible heritage registered during 2004 to 2000 to 2014. And because of it, I will take 3 examples that makes possible for us to understand this policy. And first, these are, I'm sorry, I wasn't be able to translate because it's, I can't change this, and I have someone that made it for me. So you have the intangible heritage in Brazil. So we can see that in South Zone until 2014, it has changed. We didn't have any intangible heritage. So it's like we don't have a popular culture in the South. Now, I will not discuss this now, but it's a very nice theme to discuss about national identity. So you can see there. So we have Baianas de Acarajé or Acarajé Baianas. Né? Acarajé is a food made with beans. It's like a dumpling, and it's very popular in Bahia, but also in other states of Brazil, as here in Rio. It's made by beans, shrimp, salad, and it's fried. Yeah, I don't like it, but don't let the Baianas know, okay? And it's good, but I have the problems with the oil. So Baianas is the name of the women who cook and sell the acarajé, and usually on the streets, and it's associated with the Afro-Brazilian religions. Its registry has been requested by the Baianas Association in part because of the increasing of neo-Pentecostal sellers, which were threatening the work of these women through the Brazilian streets. The savoir-faire of the traditional baianas was recognized in 2005 by IFAM, and after that, the safeguarding plans started to be designed. The fact that these women savoir-faire become heritage helped them gain the right to have authorization from the municipal governments of Rio and Salvador to establish fixed points of sale on the streets. Also, in 2013 and 2014, these women quarreled with FIFA because they wanted to have the right to sell their products within the Fonte Nova Stadium in Salvador during the World Cup matches. They were used to sell it before the World Cup matches. So they started to make a lot of noise. Now there is take off the hands of my acarajé. You know, it's similar with your sellers, yes. According to FIFA, only the official sponsors can be inside and close to the stadiums. As national Brazilian heritage, these women conquered the right to sell within the stadiums. So finally, they sell it. But we need to say that it wasn't an IFAM policy. In fact, it was a positive result of the fight for rights of these women using the IFAM and the government discourse. They also charged the IFAM with support in these disputes. But in the case of the dispute with the neo-Pentecostal sellers, the IFAM has not yet come up with a solid answer. The support and promotion programs are only accessible to traditional baianas. That is, they dress like baianas and sell the acarajé. And it's really associated to Afro-Brazilian religions. In general, neo-Pentecostal sellers can call their product Jesus acarajé, or it's like a Jesus dumpling, denying and fighting against Afro-Brazilian religions, associated with the creation universe of this food. Although neo-Pentecostal sellers do not have access to safeguard plans, they continue to grow and spread throughout the streets, and FAM has a hard time making protective actions because the registry does not generate intellectual property for its producers. So they can't be denied to sell the neo-Pentecostal ones. And in this case, the addition of a market dispute, we have the problem of religious intolerance, which is a really big problem, huge problem in Brazil. Okay, more than 10 years after the registry, the principal problem that is generated the registry as a protective policy for these women is still a problem. In fact, it is a bigger one. Now the samba de roda case. So, samba de roda is a type of samba, and it's usually played in Bahia, in a part of Bahia. It was registered in 2004, and its safeguarding plan is also shown as a model, also by UNESCO. It should be taken into account that even in cases where the official proponent is a civil society association, as indicated by IFAM in the database that I mentioned, the whole of public power, such as in the case of the samba de roda, should not be ignored. This cultural manifestation was in danger of extinction because various reasons. The idea of IFAM was to act so that this danger would be reversed, creating interest in the younger ones and also creating the financial conditions so that the samba de roda practitioners could maintain themselves. In this case, unlike the Baianas, there was a direct interest of the Minister of Culture during Lula government. Because after the national registration, the Brazilian government wanted to present a candidature to the list of UNESCO. And now it's a heritage, World Heritage since 2005. For this reason, the registry and the safeguard plan were made in record time, as can be seen in this, this one. Samba de roda took only 53 days. So it's completely different. As measure of the safeguard plan, samba de roda practitioners, generally Afro-Brazilians and poor people, had access to training courses, IFAN support for recording CDs, and conducting concerts all around the country, among a number of other elements. In addition to visibility, social visibility, the safeguarding plan has resulted in the recovery of a Black and popular cultural tradition and the improvement of life in these communities. IFAN also created a reference center, Samba de Roda Reference Center in 2007. Well, the registration process in this case opened the possibility of a set of financing that showed immediate results for those poor communities in the interior of Bahia. I will talk very fast about, capoeira. So capoeira was registered in 2008. And this case is very interesting because they asked a lot of things, and the Minister of Culture told them that it would be done. And they asked for a special pension, like a social assistance. And the state told them that the state could not give it to them because the national security had specific rules. So if they didn't pay, they can't receive. But they are in the precarious market and very poor people. And it was the principal act of safeguarding in this case. So the state denied, and it's denied until now. But then in 2014, in the general law of the World Cup, the state gave a sort of pension to the soccer players in 1958, 1962, and in the 1970. And to finish, really, so actually what I wanted to tell you is the Brazilian public policy for immaterial heritage in general is highlighted as a model by UNESCO. Nevertheless, not all actions, as we saw above succeed and can be considered as a model of policy. Capoeira, as we could see, was one of the cases that safeguarding plan, after 9 years of its registry, never left the paper. Capoeira also is associated with the previous administrations of the Ministry of Culture, so it have political problems. In the case of Baiana Jacarajé, we have the limits of the registry that until now is an instrument that can't help with legal issues related to property. So one of the functions of the immaterial heritage would be precisely to do the mediation between the past and the present, but even which future is intended to follow it. So this public policy is very important to the future of these communities. Well, to really finish, the preservation of intangible heritage and its symbolic action has the objective of opening up possibilities for financing programs and designing public policies for social inclusion for people that have historically been marginalized in Brazil, such as native groups, Afro-Brazilian, poorer sections of society. Nevertheless, as I have tried to demonstrate briefly, the policy aimed at the preservation of intangible heritage brings very different results and even different designs. In some cases, the policy was important for these social groups have access to rights. In others, the action is mainly of this on the symbolic plane, and we perceive difficulties of being translated in concrete actions and policies. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to see some pictures of food. Lunch is around the corner. So as usual, the floor is open for comments, questions. And also, remember, this is one integrated panel. So if some thoughts have occurred to you on the previous presentations, which you didn't state at that time, you know, you should address those now. Get the mic.
Thank you for the presentations. I have a question about the informal markets that are in India or in Thailand before the street vendors. To what extent governments can regulate and control and make the sidewalks orderly and clean for the citizens and users, and to what extent it's necessary to keep them working and ongoing to make sure that they are providing the citizens, especially the underprivileged and marginalized citizens, with means to earn an income. So it's always an issue that's difficult to regulate. In Egypt, for example, they've over the years made efforts to move them out to suburb areas or to remote areas away from the city center. But when they do so, it's resisted by the vendors themselves, because in these new places they do not find their customers around anymore. They may be living in the city center on the rooftop of buildings or in slum areas nearby. So when they move off to the suburb areas, they are totally resisting this situation. But at the same time, when they are left to operate, they're crowding the streets. It's a big mess. And it's really not very conducive to attracting tourists, for example, to the area. So how do different cities deal with this challenge?
Well, thank you. I have some questions for the informal markets. What do you think the effects of demonetization have been? You touched briefly on people's choices about whether to go digital. How easy is that? What opportunities are there to make use of digital change, and especially for lower income markets? Is this something that is accessible to vendors and customers? In addition to, I mean, this is a large question, but you alluded to the need to move beyond the binaries of formal, informal. How do you think we go about that? And then in terms of cultural protection, I have two questions. I suppose, who are the stewards of the cultural knowledge and the cultural goods? And you know, is this stuck in an older generation? Is this moving to younger generations? And what happens if younger generations don't want to take up that mantle? And as part of that, to what degree does a program like this restrict the evolution of cultures and how cultures change over time?
Thank you for your presentations. The question is for Vivian. You know, we have been talking about this in the IDPPA mode. I'm just going back to the IDPPA sort of thinking from the global south. Somehow there is a lot of criticism around the world. Not all of it is properly documented. why you have to go to UNESCO to say that this is a cultural heritage? Why do not we have sufficient self-respect to say that this is our cultural artifact, tangible or non-tangible, and it is good enough? Why do we need somebody else's rubber stamp? Because I know in India and in many other places, the moment a cultural heritage site is designated as a cultural heritage site officially, then you have to do everything for its preservation, which has to be confirmed by somebody sitting in UNESCO in Paris. And you know now what is happening to UNESCO. It's cut down by half 5-6 years ago, and the way it may be one day it may disappear. So I realize across traveling in many countries that we have not stepped up to the plate of self-respect with regard to our own culture. We are trying to convince somebody through complicated UN application forms to say that please accept. And they are culturally displaced, if not totally disorientated, to understand what we are telling them. So how do you see that going to UNESCO and then the local politics set in, versus why not we start to have our own standards, to have some self-respect with regard to our own culture?
What was fascinating about both presentations, or at least what I thought I heard, was how it was the social construction of markets, you know, and some of them might be embedded or disembedded, and in terms of whether or not they're formal or informal, you know, and the state with what. Then the second thing they learn is that the politics of recognition and redistribution. Yeah, I mean, Arjun Appajurai's work on saying is that how does the state, or how the terms of trade between the state and the poor is changed, you know, and is constantly evolving. Then in the third kind of line, what I'm hearing is that obviously that informality, less with the second presentation, but was more, but also in a place like India, where informality is the new normal, where the kind of 90% of the jobs are generated in the informal sector. You know, that's what I understand. And then the last one is that so the question I want to ask in this context is, what is the role of political parties, not the state? What is the role of political parties in embedding markets, or promoting the embedding of markets in kind of more productivity enhancing, redistributive ways?
Thank you. A very quick question actually to Vivian also about a role of another stakeholder here in this area, which is business. And I'm not talking about individual entrepreneurship, but rather larger size businesses. Given that there is obviously a link to tourism industry, and given that there's probably the whole concept of territory branding, are there any attempts to link these objects of social heritage to commercial fundraising rather than or is it maybe a liberal decision to leave it as completely social object without associations of commercializing it? So thank you.
Thank you very much. This was really an excellent set of presentations, very poignant to the needs of today, because on the material side, on the technological side, on almost every life science, we already have all the answers, we have the means and so on. The task and challenge is to put the intangible of human behavior, in other words, our social psychology, our cultural psychology. And when that is done, You have to be coherent with evolution, and coherence means dynamic coherence. You cannot have material as factors without the immaterial. You can't have quantity without quality, or tangible without the intangible. And now, from all that has happened here, it is very clear that we can start from almost any vector, as I mentioned on the last thing about you decide tax. But if you simply take historic examples, for example, may I, Robin, you'll permit me to cite the 1860 Homestead Act was extremely intelligent. Not necessarily viewed that way, but it was extremely intelligent, very simple. They told the capable immigrants and people they could, and so you go out into the interior and you farm the land, and after 5 years or something, then you can own the land. And they did. And what did they do with the policies? They integrated monetary, economic, and social policies so that the produce of the farms was able to produce profit enough, banks would come, and the role of the central government there was to encourage, by regulation, that the bank had to reinvest in each state. Now, that meant that after 20 years, the United States had a more or less homogenic standard of living, according to history records, from coast to coast. There's no reason why that cannot function on a micro level, because small is easier to manage. And therefore, even going down to the street market situation, if you move to a different part of the city or wherever it is, you can apply the same content, but we have the means to give people the knowledge now. So I'd just like to put that that particular point there, because it helped to get the World Bank to start deciding funding entire communities and not just the big project that comes from that community. So there was a socioeconomic capacitation. And if you look at donated funding, you can look at it from first of all, the trust, delivered integrity, and secondly, you look at it from the vectorial point of view. So it has to have a kind of meridian plus meridian plus meridian exponentiality. And if it has that, then most of these comments and difficulties that we're having would start changing. It won't happen overnight, but any cooperative, as I mentioned before, any cooperative has a psychology. I'll use one very quick example. If you have 3 farmers, one makes tomatoes, one makes lettuce, and the other cucumbers, and the fellow with tomatoes, his tomatoes were selling bad and doing bad for the cooperative because they're full of black spots. The colleagues, the lettuce and the cucumber farmers, will come and help this fellow to make marketable tomatoes. That is how you start creating wealth. That was the basis of ancient ideas of merchant banking, investment banking now, so that you involve all the components and not just one single project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have echoing what Bharat said, are there any political conflicts with respect to intangible culture here, in the sense that I'll illustrate this. There is a form of sport on a festival day in South India, which is called Jallikattu, which simply means you let a well-fed, lovingly cared for bull that's very strong run, and men have to go and grab it by the horns and try to pin it down with bare hands. It's a very risky sport. But the Organization Internationally for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals came in and influenced the government, which imposed a ban on this. Now, this created a great outrage because this is a traditional practice, and no one is saying anything about bullfighting in Spain, where the animal is eventually killed, And here this animal is preserved and protected and used the next year for a similar sport. And if anyone gets hurt, it's the human beings, not the animal. So there are these, so it's a big controversy, and this sort of put South India against this central government in Delhi and created so there are many instances of this kind of thing where, you know, a way of life and a conventional practice is, so, you know, you may raise the same sorts of questions about martial arts. Do they have Wednesbury rules that govern heavyweight boxing? No. Then is that all right? Not all right. So these are some of the things I'd like you to wind up with, and you have some questions to address, and then we can all go for lunch.
All right. Well, I'll be short and quick, not trying to hold everyone for lunch, but I guess there were three larger questions that were asked. First was on looking at largely the question of trying to promote development with displacement and the issues of how citizen or accessibility of citizen infrastructure can be taken care of. I guess it's a difficult one, but at least and to understand, I'm not someone who's doing a lot of research on urban planning, but if you look at Delhi, for example, there is enough evidence that you can find where if you go to the central, the Lutyens part of Delhi, which is where most of the parliamentarians and the markets are set up, you see a lot more done on the planning level in trying to have sidewalks, and that's right. While if you go back to a different part, let's say the northern side, which is seen somehow as the periphery. I also find these terms also problematic. You have a periphery and you have a core. Why periphery can also be your core, because if you look at the ancient cultural history of Delhi, it's primarily those markets that have evolved. That's where the Red Fort is. Most of the Mughal architectural comments are there. So I guess what's needed is, and I guess somewhere Sunstein and Thaler's work, which is now being kind of celebrated after Richard Thaler's Nobel, tends to look at, is there is a way in which you can nudge or use or exercise some form of libertarian paternalism in trying to allow for governments to work out a way with the people there. Most people in the way we were interviewing were only saying that we don't mind moving to a space where we can have a space for the market to be able to function. But the idea is, if you're trying to put someone who is located at a certain center point to be going into the suburbs or a completely different area, of course, that's contagious to their business, right? That's where the 5 Ps work. You need position to be involved in it. So if you think it from a business perspective, that's fine. Now, I find it a bit baffling as well. You have malls set up right in the center of the city because that's geospatially good for the business of those malls. There, those issues of disbursement don't often come in because you've done it for a certain corporate lobbying interest or whatever that may be. So there's enough ways around that you can nudge for governance or citizen rights to be given, whether it's for people with a certain disability in terms of most of those infrastructural logistics to work out by not displacing or causing structural displacement. A lot of people today are talking about an infrastructural development in India is happening with huge displacement costs, which is going to cause a further degree of informalization. So I guess that's on the citizen planning method. So how is that you can use nudge as a very good exercise. The second is on demonetization. So I guess we did run a few articles in dailies trying to make people aware about how demonetization was dismally failing in its impact. The idea of demonetization was pull out 2 of the main currency denominations, that's rupees 500 and 1000, which is 80% of India's money circulation out of the market. And it was done to see as a corrective measure for black money circulation. It was not done with the mandated goal to digitize cash payments. That's a change in narrative that happens 3 months after demonetization is announced because not much money was coming in. So the government also kept on changing its narrative of what purpose it was, because there was a huge spike in cash digital transactions, but most of these people already had access to Paytm and different modes of digital payments, while the people that or the narratives that we're talking about had no access to these measures. Now, are you trying to forcefully formalize ways of transactions? Yes, you can at the consumer level. That means at the time where a person is selling the product, you can do that and ask the person to make the payment through a card, because I or someone else may have that card. But the problem is that, as is pointed out, there's a supply chain logistics that happen. You're working to procure the product from a person who does not have that. It's the same problem which is happening with the second policy measure, that's the goods and services tax, which Brazil experimented with as well at some point. That you are getting a product, the other person does not have a license or a tax invoice, and you can no longer get the product till that other person gets it. That this disrupted the market completely. So you're just sitting on for huge lines of credit. So I would say that it lacked a consequentially sensitive approach, as to point out what we were saying. It was completely independent of what consequences would be, both in the short term. Long-term impact has not been seen at all. And I think it's a disastrous experiment to do that with knowing that your 80% of your economy is informal in terms of the market. Informal in the sense it's not protected for, not in the sense that they're not people, but informal in the sense they have a regulatory capacity. The third point, I think Feroz made this point on Apodharai's work. I'm a big fan of Apodharai's looking at the consumerist culture. And this article that comes to mind often is The Thing of Things that he recently published. And he was trying to compare the consumerist culture anthropologically between the US and India. And when he speaks of India, he says India is not India alone. There are multiple fragmentations. You can see India as a continent by itself. But the useful distinction is between two terms of materiality and abstraction that he brings out. Materiality tends to mean that in the US, you see people are using goods to serve another mean. Right? You buy a house because you need that as a retirement safety measure. You buy a car because you're trying to treat for isolation. So there is some materiality that is working about in the consumerist culture within the US, which is not the case in the Indian context, which he argues. That India's consumerist culture works on a level of abstraction. People are completely buying or selling goods because that's something which we've been doing as a matter of, we have family legacies in place. There's a kinship or a family institutional practice of selling. But the idea is not to leave to an end. I just like selling remotes because I enjoy it. I see like kids getting happy. So there's a level of abstraction that is operating. I guess Apodharai's interpretation is absolutely right in that part, because he's looking at these bazaars itself, the markets that we are trying to study. So that's a very interesting anecdote, and I guess that's something that one tends to, or one can build upon. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. Sorry? Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah, so I guess there's a lot that's happening within Delhi itself in the central part. Let's say the part where you have markets like Connaught Place. I don't want to go into the specifics, but the central part of the city has a very active, not recognized collective bargaining unions. You cannot go and do business. You can't be a seller of leaves, which is called as the pan that you have as a desert, or anything else. You can't sell any food unless you have a contact with one of those people. And they are very powerful with the government there itself. And Delhi's political circle gives you a very good example, because Delhi's nature as a state by itself is very different as compared to other cities. So if we, for example, go to Calcutta or a different other market of the city, or Bombay or Bangalore, we may not see that level of huge political confluence or convergence. That union between, or nexus, if I use the word, between some of these informal town vending collective bargaining unions and the current government, or any government that is a part of it, is extremely strong. But that's spatially located only in the center and those which have that amount of access. So in Delhi Heart, very strong, right? Connaught Place, very strong, but not in the old markets or the weekly market. That's where they need it. The argument was, we need a union because we are the most exploited, because we have a weekly market and we are kind of asked to disrupt on a given day. There is, I'll just give an example, but there's one way in which what happens is, a lot of the markets are set up at certain hours and during the days. And there is one person who has a very good connection. One has to understand the role of the local police here. not the municipality. The local police is very important because that's the one which is managing law and order. So one of the persons with the local police would have a contact. Police would inform there is a raid that may happen in the next 1 hour. Within 1 hour, the entire market disappears. Right? That works effectively well in Connaught Place in different parts of the city even now. And that's been there. So when you have already a certain consideration, you have all the means to work towards the kind of things that they are looking for, the 5 Ps that we were talking about. Thank you.
No, yes. So about the tourism and commercial industry, here. With the paneleiras that I showed, the pens, they started to identify the authenticity of the geographical production. So to help the paneleiras to sell the pens with the symbol, no? And actually with the baianas, if you walk around the streets in Rio, Salvador, you're going to see the traditional baianas with a big banner, which is written National Cultural Heritage, to identify that these baianas are really traditional. So you can buy the acarajé there. You're going to buy the real, the authentic acarajé. But IFAM has huge problems to solve those things. They don't have a big infrastructure, and they are institution associated to the cultural minister. So it's a really poor area of the government. They don't have a lot of they don't have a lot of money, and they have problems to have support of the other areas of the government, the federal government. So, but it has some conflicts with how to promote tourism and also promote the social experience of the community. So if you promote the event for the tourist or for the inside the community, so a lot of conflicts with this. And if you talk about samba de roda, we have small geographic areas. But if you talk about baianas, we have baianas all around the country. Capoeira, we have all around the country and around the world too. So it's difficult to make a safeguarding plan, and so it's really hard to design a safeguarding plan to all the community. But I think it would be they have to do it, because if they work with projects, special projects, they are always trying to fix something very small. And why do we have to go to UNESCO? Yeah, it's a problem, because actually when we go to UNESCO, first we have to have a national political structure. But in fact, we have this, we have the public policy, but the problem is the effectivity of this one. And to go to UNESCO is always that idea that, so if we have the UNESCO stamp, yes, we are able to ask more money or to make the other areas of the government a few more sensible to this subject. And here we have a specialist with cultural politics. cultural public policies, that he says that we have a sad tradition in Brazil in this area, that we have a huge problem with continuity. So actually, when we see the Lula's government, we see a lot of attention to this topic, to popular Black native cultural and groups. But then we started to change this. Yes, and nowadays we have a terrible scenario for this topic. No, they don't have money. So go to UNESCO is always like this. But I agree with you. It's more important to develop here in Brazil a really strong public policy. And with the conflicts, yeah, we have a lot of conflicts, more like we say, federal government, municipal government. No, so which one will be the one to be the principal institution, and a lot of those things. When we have here in Brazil the case of viola de coxo, it's like a guitar that it was made with the monkey. Yes. So at the same case, they have to substitute the monkey stomach or intestine, I don't know. Yes, to another artificial one, and it was a conflict to. Yes. So I think I tried to.
Just Laila, I guess 3 district or city administrations that you can look at. I wanted to point it out, but I just completely forgot. Ottawa, which was earlier called as the Bytown market in Canada, they did something similar to try to segregate spaces for vendors and the markets. Taipei is where I personally saw that there's a lot that the city-based administration did in terms of protecting night markets. And the other was, third is Gangtok in Sikkim. That's a state northeast in India itself, which has done a lot. So I mean, one can look at comparative basis. Thank you.
Okay. With the younger interests, I don't know who asked me this, but well, IFAN tries to motivate young people to get interested in traditional and popular culture. But if they are not, after 10 years, if it's not a cultural reference, it will not be again immaterial heritage. So we keep the historical registry, but it's not a new registry or well.
Thank you. Now I thank all these the presenters for very good presentations, and for sticking to time and not making me tear my hair out and making my work more easy than I feared it might be. So I'm very relieved that the session has come to an end, and we can give a big round of applause in thanks to the participants. Veronica, any announcements? Cool. This thing is just good.